The Second World War for Adolf Hitler had been an intense period of ups and downs. In 1939, 40, and all the way up until very late in 1941, he was the conqueror of Europe. He had gone further than any other had before. Napoleon's empire of shaky client states was as nothing compared to Hitler's Third Reich, which now dominated all of continental Europe, essentially except for Russia's three major cities, Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. These prizes were kept from him. Whether it was the winter, Hitler's strategy, or the stubbornness of his generals is immaterial. What matters is that the period of slow decline now began, both in terms of territory and in terms of the Führer's own health. By now, Hitler was under absolutely incomprehensible amounts of stress, and it showed on his face. He was aging several months, if not years, for every month that passed. Soon enough, he looked like a shadow of his former self, and indeed, he had an incurable heart condition, amongst other health issues. Time was certainly not on Hitler's side. By the time the Italian king and his generals defected in 1943, the war had decisively turned in the Allies' favour. The Allies would shortly entrench themselves in southern Italy, and the Germans were simply unable to dislodge them. Allied air and naval supremacy was just too strong. In the east, there were occasional whispers of peace, but Hitler, more often than not, would just refuse to hear them. Regardless, the east was undergoing a slow and steady collapse. The Soviets were regaining Crimea, pushing forwards all along the front. What preoccupied the Führer's mind, however, was not the Soviets, but the Allies. It was an open secret that an Anglo-American landing would take place in 1944. France was the most likely location, but there was still doubts, and the Germans had no entirely solid intel. All they knew was that they were coming. Hitler was heard in his weaker moments to openly admit that if they gained a foothold in France, then the war would be over. On the home front too, the people's morale was sagging. Things weren't looking hopeful, but somehow he had to navigate the turbulent year of 1944. A few things before we begin. First, this video is part of a series on the life of Adolf Hitler. It can easily be watched on its own, but if you'd like to start from episode 1, then you're more than welcome to do so, and the link will be in the description, or front and centre on my channel homepage. Secondly, the topic of this video is Hitler, so by its very nature, it's a controversial topic. However, I urge you not to overthink it. This video is simply a work of history, nothing more, nothing less. Most of all, it is certainly not political, so please be normal. Thank you. Lastly, a huge thank you to my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, then I simply wouldn't be able to do this for a living, and I cannot thank them enough. So if you'd like to support the channel, join our Discord, or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider signing up in one of the links in the description. Thank you. 1944 began much the same way the previous year had ended. On the 4th of January, Field Marshal Manstein was at the Wolf's Lair, requesting permission to withdraw his entire southern sector. He was given a stern no by the Führer. Hitler explained that Manstein had to hold on, but also that he could give him no more divisions. He was playing for time, he said, as in May the U-boat campaign would begin, and soon enough, in Hitler's mind, the Allied-Soviet alliance would split. Also, during the first days of the year, Hitler was making plans for his superweapons. He wanted to make sure the production figures stayed on target. The three projects Hitler held dearest were Dönitz advanced U-boats, the Luftwaffe's jet aircraft, and Speer's rockets. He explained to Milch and Speer how much the jets meant to him. Quote, "If I get the jets in time, I can fight off the invasion with them. If I get a few hundred of them to the front line, it will exercise the spectre of invasion for all time." End quote. This was a frequent theme of Hitler's. He believed that the Allies would, and could, land on the beach, but he felt that if he had his jet aircraft, they could simply bomb the beaches with a lightning strike, spreading disorder and horror amongst the Allied ranks whilst they massed on the beaches. This would essentially make any future invasion untenable and doomed to fail, at least in Hitler's imagination. In 1943, Adolf Hitler had, as we know, had Mussolini rescued from his prison cell, where he waited to be handed over to the Allies, and obviously, executed. At first, Mussolini seemed done with everything. He just wanted to go and retire on a farm in northern Italy with his family. He didn't even want to wreak revenge upon those who had betrayed him in the Grand Council of Fascism. His daughter, who was married to one of the traitors, Count Ciano, was even blackmailing him to take no action. In January, however, Mussolini's iron will, briefly, returned. The traitors, at least the ones who could be caught, including Ciano, were hunted down, tied to chairs, and faced with a firing squad on the 11th of January. A letter from Edda Mussolini, Ciano's wife, arrived to Hitler after she escaped to Switzerland. Quote, "Führer, twice I believed your word, and twice I have been cheated. Only the soldiers lying on the battlefields prevent me from deserting to the enemy. If my husband is not released, nothing but that will stop me. For some time now, the documents have been held by people authorized to make use of them if anything were to happen to my husband, me, my children, or my family." End quote. A similar letter was sent to her father, too. The Germans weren't yet sure what exactly she was talking about, or what she actually had on her father. Meanwhile, there was other positive signs in Italy. Mussolini was building a new, smaller-scale Italian army, and down south the Allies were making near enough no progress. 6 miles a month had been all they could muster since late September. It was clear that Italy was not going to be the decisive blow the Anglo-Americans had imagined when they landed there the year prior. In Turkey, too, intercepted British messages revealed that they had essentially given up on dragging Turkey into the war, which had been their big plan for late 1943. The Turkish foreign minister had bluntly told the Brits, quote, "We are not so stupid as to get dragged into a war against our own interests for the second time in 25 years, end quote. All of this vital intel came from their Albanian informant, who acted as a manservant for the British ambassador. He was working miracles, and was duly rewarded with 250,000 gold marks at Ribbentrop's personal behest. In terms of the Führer's personal life, early 1944 was reaching its natural conclusion. His health continued to decline, and his signature shaking arm by now had become obvious, and the Führer only heard whatever Bormann and Himmler wanted him to hear of the home front, or the Reich's internal affairs. Hitler was more isolated than ever before. Bormann's isolation of him was essentially complete, and by now the old faces were slipping away from Hitler's entourage. Dr. Morell complained of the lonely atmosphere, quote, "Bormann is mostly away on business in Berlin and Munich. Heini Hoffmann only puts in a guest appearance every 4 weeks or so. Scarcely anybody of the old clique is still here. The headquarters has outgrown itself, and most people are preoccupied with themselves," end quote. The circle soon became even smaller, as Hitler's beloved Viennese dietitian, Marlene von Exner, was discovered to have had a Jewish great-grandmother. Hitler had to reluctantly dismiss her. He said to her, quote, "I cannot make one rule for myself, and another for the rest," end quote. As a result, though, she would survive the war, unlike her successor. In the West, meanwhile, Rommel was busy in his new role of preparing the defence of France. Hitler reasoned that the Allies had only gotten a foothold in Africa and Italy because of the treacherous Italians. Here, however, it will be different with Rommel. Quote, "They won't find any of those here. They'll get the thrashing of their lives. I am convinced that when the time comes, it will be a huge relief," end quote. Rommel and Hitler agreed on their strategy in the West. Hitler sums it up, quote, "The main thing is that the moment the invasion begins, the enemy must be smothered in bombs. That'll force them to take cover, and even if there's only one jet airborne, they'll still be forced to take cover, and this will delay them hour upon hour. But in half a day, our reserves will be well on their way," end quote. It was in this same vein that Rommel argued that the panzer divisions must be kept right up by the coast so they could deal quickly with any enemy invasion. Hitler spoiled Rommel with resources to make their dream a reality, and he set about building their impenetrable coastal fortress. The local French population actually helped with the utmost enthusiasm in preparing the defences according to Rommel, as they knew full well what would happen if their lands were turned into a battlefield. The Allies certainly weren't shy of civilian casualties, and indeed, neither were the Germans. In the south, the Americans tried a naval invasion south of Rome at Anzio behind the German lines. The Germans failed to react quickly, but the Americans also failed to exploit their success. The result was a stalemate and the encirclement of the American beachhead. When Hitler inquired as to why intelligence had failed to predict the landings, the reasoning given was Admiral Canaris of the Abwehr. In Turkey, too, Canaris had been tricked by a double agent, and he was indeed playing a double game himself by this stage. His failure even resulted in Cicero's operations coming to an end in Turkey too. He was duly dismissed, and Himmler was tasked with setting up a united German intelligence service. His failure even resulted in the Albanian informant named Cicero's operations coming to an end in Turkey. He was duly dismissed, and Himmler was tasked with setting up a united German intelligence service. In the east, things continued to decline. 284,000 German troops had been encircled at Cherkasy on the Dnieper River. Weeks of fighting ensued, but eventually Hitler allowed the garrison to break out towards their own lines. This meant the abandonment of their wounded to the enemy, an almost certain death sentence. The escape was bitter. Thousands fell in the fighting, and many that survived drowned in the icy waters trying to cross the river. Only 30,000 men made it back to German lines. The Führer set off for the Berghof in late February. The war was declining so fast that East Prussia was now easy prey for British and American bombers. The Wolf's Lair itself was no longer safe, and so Hitler headed back to the Berghof, whilst the Todd organisation moved in to build up much stronger bunkers during his absence. Whilst at his idyllic mountain retreat, he met with his armaments dictators, Milch and Sauer. They gave the Führer a positive report on future aircraft, tank and gun production, and spoke with him about their plans to take production underground, where the Allied bombers could no longer harass them. Hitler immediately released 64 of the miners working on the air raid shelters at the Berghof, and told Sauer to acquire 10,000 more. Another important figure came to Hitler with a strange request around this time too. Walter Schellenberg, chief of Himmler's Foreign Intelligence Service, later recalled Foreign Minister Ribbentrop's strange plan. Quote, Ribbentrop told the Führer frankly that their biggest and most dangerous enemy was the Soviet Union. The Führer shared this view, and even mused out loud that Stalin was the only one for whom he could find the necessary respect, if one day he was going to reach a compromise peace with somebody after all. He, Ribbentrop, then announced to the Führer his willingness to sacrifice his own life if he could save Germany thereby. His plan was to do all he could to lure Stalin once more to the conference table, then he would gun him down. For a long time the Führer had turned this over in his mind, and then finally replied, "No, I don't like anything like that. It would be asking for trouble from Providence." End quote. Goebbels, too, came to the Berghof in mid-March. Together they sat and watched several colour movies that Eva Braun had taken of them at the Berghof in 1939 and again in 1942. The stark comparison in Hitler's health would have been extremely obvious to the propaganda minister. Hitler, meanwhile, remarked to Goebbels that he had just wanted the Allied invasion to come already so he could get it over and done with. The most important event of early 1944, however, was not jet production or anything like that, but Hitler's own shaky allies. Antonescu in Romania swore continued loyalty to Hitler, and the Führer believed him, and indeed, he had every reason. Horthy in Hungary, however, was essentially openly rebelling against the Axis cause. The regent had refused to recognise the new Mussolini government in Italy, and had the nerve to receive a legation from both Mussolini's government and the Badoglio government instead. He had also requested the return of the 9 Hungarian divisions policing the rear areas of the Russian front. Worst of all, Prime Minister Calais was advocating for sabotaging German trains that ran through Hungary to Manstein and Kleist's army groups. Hitler felt he was left with no choice, and Operation Margarita was drawn up. On the 15th of March, Horthy was invited to meet Hitler at Klesheim Castle near Salzburg in 3 days' time. As bait, Hitler offered to discuss the military points Horthy had raised in a letter a month prior. As a result, his generals came with him too. Hitler promised himself that he would no longer accept any of Horthy's typical slippery excuses this time. In April 1943, the Führer had said to General Zietzler, quote, "He's a cunning rogue. Yesterday I got him to agree with everything I wanted in private. And today he comes back and says, 'You know, I'm very hard of hearing. It seems I only understood half of what you were saying yesterday.'" End quote. At the meeting on the 18th, Horthy asked to speak with Hitler in private in German without his usual interpreter. The Führer agreed and proceeded to give it to Horthy straight. Prime Minister Calais was to be replaced immediately, he said. On top of this, he informed the regent that he had instructed 12 German divisions to assist the new government. The Hungarian divisions currently mobilised on the Romanian frontier were to be sent to the Russian front instead. Horthy took all of this for a bluff, and immediately charged out of the room, shouting, quote, "If it's all been decided already, there's no point in my staying." End quote. Hitler had already pre-prepared for such a slippery move, so typical of Horthy. An air raid siren was sounded on his signal, and a smoke screen was laid across the castle. His train would not be allowed to leave in the middle of an air raid, Hitler said. As the day progressed, Horthy quickly realised the obvious fact that he had been ambushed, and at 8 p.m. he cabled instructions back to his leaderless government that they were not to resist the German invasion. The only concession the admiral managed to wring out of Hitler was that Budapest itself would not be occupied, except for a small guard of honour for Horthy. At 9 p.m, Hitler walked the old man to his train. They would never see each other again. The events weren't concluded, however. Horthy's train was deliberately held up in Austria to prevent Horthy changing his mind, as he always did. The train would only be allowed home if his cabinet back in Budapest honoured the agreement. At 4 a.m. on the 19th, the 4 German battle groups swept into Hungary. It all went off without a hitch. When Horthy himself finally arrived back in the capital, he was met by his ominous-looking guard of honour. Before the move had even been completed, Hitler had ordered Sauer to exploit Hungarian industry at once to help the war effort. The arrangement worked out for pretty much everyone. The lower ranks of the Hungarian forces actually welcomed the occupation, as now they would get the support they required. The Hungarian contingent in the east now doubled in size. Romania's forces also increased, as they no longer needed to worry about a Hungarian invasion. The troops could be sent east instead. This wasn't a permanent solution though. On the 28th of March, Field Marshal von Weichs wrote after seeing Hitler, quote, "The Führer mistrusts the Hungarians, and particularly hates the regent, who no doubt equally loathes Germany. The links with the enemy powers still exist. Her defection is still to be reckoned with, a colossal danger for the Eastern Front. Thus, as few Hungarians as possible to be under arms, though it would be impossible to disarm the army completely." End quote. On the 20th of March, Hitler had met with the leading Western Front generals. Rommel described the speech as having been with, quote, marvellous clarity and sovereign composure, end quote. There was a shorthand record of the speech in Rommel's papers. Quote, obviously an Anglo-American invasion in the West is going to come. Just how and where, nobody knows, and it isn't practicable to speculate. You can't take shipping concentrations at face value for some kind of clue that their choice has fallen on any particular sector of our long Western Front from Norway down to the Bay of Biscay, or the Mediterranean or Balkans. Such concentrations can always be moved around or transferred at any time, under cover of bad visibility, and they will obviously be used to dupe us. The most suitable landing areas, and hence, those that are in most danger, are the two west coast peninsulas of Cherbourg and Brest. They offer very tempting possibilities for the creation of bridgeheads, which could thereafter be systematically enlarged by the massive use of air power, end quote. He continued on, quote, the enemy's entire invasion operation must not, under any circumstances, be allowed to survive longer than hours, or at most, days, taking Dieppe as an ideal example. Once defeated, the enemy will never again try to invade. Quite apart from their heavy losses, they will need months to organise a fresh attempt, and an invasion failure will also deliver a crushing blow to British and American morale. For one thing, it will prevent Rosenberg from being re-elected in the United States. With any luck, he'll finish up in a jail somewhere. For another, war weariness will grip Britain even faster, and Churchill, already a sick old man with his influence waning, won't be able to carry through a new invasion operation, end quote. Eventually, he stressed just how important repulsing this invasion was. Quote, the 45 divisions that we now hold throughout Europe apart from the Eastern Front are badly needed in the East. As soon as we have forced a decision in the West, we shall transfer them to the East to revolutionise the situation there, so the whole outcome of the war depends on each man fighting in the West, and that means the fate of the Reich as well, end quote. Hitler was often prone to making ridiculous remarks about the state of the war, but he was quite right on this regard. No matter how bad things were in the East, the war could still be brought to some kind of conclusion by repulsing the Allied invasion in the West. If the invasion was attempted, encircled, and destroyed, the Allied populations would be clamouring for peace as soon as possible. If the invasion succeeded, however, it would be all over for Germany. Rommel, for one, was extremely reassured, quote, we have the utmost confidence that we'll get by in the West, end quote. Whilst preparations were made for the West, there was still the war to be won on the home front. In the East, the Russians had tried, and executed, some German officers as war criminals. Hitler yearned for his revenge. On the 23rd of March, he spoke with Wolfgang Huel, quote, British and American war criminals must be condemned to death, and their confessions must also be publicised after their execution, end quote. David Irving describes the predicament at length, quote, Allied airmen, accused of machine gunning civilians, were to be put on trial. General Jodl suggested that since the enemy automatically executed all German agents, they should do the same with the 500 British and American agents and saboteurs who had fallen into their net in Hungary. The Führer mentioned, noted Huel, that some had special assignments to murder and spread bacilli epidemics. On the night of March the 24th, the British again dumped nearly 2,500 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs on Berlin. No Geneva Convention forbade these murderous bombing raids. When the next morning Himmler announced at the Berghof that 80 Allied airmen had just escaped from Wehrmacht prison camp at Sagan, Hitler impulsively ordered all the escapees recaptured to be turned over to the Secret Service. Himmler, you are not to let the escaped airmen out of your control. 50 of the fugitives were shot on Himmler's orders. This climate of barbarism was now pervading the war. During May 1944, Allied planes began systematically machine gunning civilian targets. Several films taken from the gun cameras of crashed fighter planes were shown at the Berghof. They showed helpless people running for their lives as the bullets streamed towards them. Hitler instructed Göring to select isolated cases and execute the culprits. Göring was reluctant, explaining to Sonnleitner that pilots could not be blamed for having hunting fever. Jodl's staff suggested giving oral instructions to the commandant of the prison cage at Oberrussel to turn over such airmen to Himmler's security police. But the technical problems, particularly of identification, proved insuperable. Everybody raised objections. Keitel was opposed to such a regularised lynch law, and Göring pointed out that clear cases of murder could be dealt with properly by constituted courts. The Foreign Ministry then stated that the Geneva Convention required a 3-month stay of execution of death sentences on prisoners of war. By this time it was late June 1944, and Hitler had more pressing problems on his mind, end quote. In early 1944, the entirety of Ukraine had passed back into Soviet hands. In 1941, when the Germans had entered, the majority of the 40 million Ukrainians had greeted the new arrivals as liberators. They were hugged, kissed, and offered the meagre food that the Ukrainians had to share. 3 years later, the situation was rather different. Erich Koch, Reich Commissar for Ukraine, had treated the Ukrainians as less than dirt. Alfred Frauenfeld, governor of the Crimea, had warned Hitler about this for a long time. He said, quote, "Even a disaster policy, deliberately planned and paid for by the enemy, could hardly have done more harm," end quote. Yet Hitler refused to stand up to Koch. As a result, hordes of Ukrainians turned to the partisan cause, and in large part thanks to their efforts, the Germans were expelled from their homeland once more. Hitler proudly boasted to Antonescu that once the enemy invasion in the west was crushed later that year, then he could bring the armies east and retake Ukraine with ease. Even now, Hitler continued to believe that the Red Army was exhausted and on its last legs. By April, Crimea was in the midst of a bitter battle. The only way out for the Germans was now by sea, yet Hitler refused their evacuation, despite General Zietzler's pleas that, quote, "Thousands of German soldiers in the Crimea will be lost if you don't act now," end quote. Hitler replied coldly, quote, "1,000 more or less are of no consequence," end quote. On the 13th of April, Hitler stated his priorities to Admiral Dönitz when he came asking for production priority for some naval items, quote, "Tanks and assault guns are my lifeblood too, but nonetheless, we've got to put up a fighter umbrella over the Reich first of all. That is the alpha and omega of it all," end quote. A week later on the 20th, the Crimean situation had taken a severe turn for the worst. The result was immediate. The Turks bowed down to Allied pressure now that the writing was on the wall. They announced that they were no longer neutral, but a pro-Allied country, and that they would stop the vital chrome deliveries to Germany within 10 days. On the 21st, the Führer was with General Hube at the Berghof, decorating him with the extremely rare Diamond Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for his heroic escape from a Soviet encirclement. The night before, Hitler had mentioned to his adjutants that he wanted to soon appoint the general as commander-in-chief of the army. That same night, however, Hube asked to fly back to Berlin early for personal reasons. The plane then crashed into a mountain near Salzburg, killing Hube immediately. Wolfgang Huell, one of Hitler's closest friends and advisors, was also in the plane and received severe burns. Hitler's health, too, was noticeably worse even compared to a few months ago. His left leg now shook so uncontrollably that he couldn't stop it, even when he was in bed. Dr. Morel was constantly in high demand by the Führer, yet the portly doctor could take the mountain air no more and lived in Berchtesgaden itself, as opposed to the Berghof. Each day he would have to make the long 1,500-foot journey for his 2 hours with Hitler. His assistant and other doctors were by this stage seeing Hitler too. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. Irving writes, quote, "Morel's consultation notes with Hitler on May the 4th and 5th, 1944, show that he was no easy patient. Hitler's stomach spasms had returned. The doctor advised an early retirement each night, but Hitler still obstinately refused to go to bed until the last enemy bomber had left German territory. In view of Hitler's heart condition, Morel advised him to gulp down some coffee or take cardiazol if he suddenly felt unwell, and recommended him to try breathing pure oxygen 2 or 3 times a day. Unbeknownst to his doctors, Hitler had begun to consume quantities of Dr. Kirster's anti-Aegis pills. He was also submitting to an incredible volume of medication through Morel's syringes, but he preferred it to the alternatives: spasms, fatigue, time-wasting exercise, and massage," end quote. For the record, the anti-Aegis pills were for his stomach problems and excessive flatulence. By April 2, the wait for the Allied invasion was killing him inside. By now, he was even beginning to doubt whether it was real at all. Perhaps it was all an elaborate bluff, he thought. He had said in early April, quote, "The whole show the British are putting on looks suspiciously like a charade to me. These latest reports of censorship and security measures over there, you don't go doing that if you're really up to something. I can't help feeling the whole thing will turn out to be a shameless charade," end quote. Meanwhile, Rommel was feeling confident in France. On the 6th of May, he wrote, quote, "From day to day we are growing stronger. My inventions are coming into action. Thus, I am looking forward to the battle with the profoundest confidence. It might be on May the 15th, or perhaps not until the end of the month," end quote. Hitler was feeling quite the opposite. On the 9th of May, Dr. Morel wrote in his notes, quote, "Leg tremor, caused by agitation, invasion imminent, where?" end quote. The trouble of where was a divisive issue. Rommel and Rundstedt felt the invasion would be on either side of the Somme estuary between Calais and Dieppe. Hitler felt that it would be in either Normandy or Brittany, so that a bridgehead could be established on the Cherbourg Peninsula. Hitler was so confident that in April he said, quote, "I am in favour of bringing all our strength here, particularly the forces we don't absolutely have to have anywhere else," end quote. On the 6th of May, Hitler requested Jodl to telephone Rundstedt's chief of staff, saying that he, quote, "attached particular importance to Normandy," end quote. Hitler would bang on and on about this point, yet Rommel and Rundstedt refused to be drawn in, and their plans remained the same. Only one of them was going to be right when the time came, however. Meanwhile, the Allies themselves were getting prepared for the big day. A vicious air campaign was taking place on French communications. Bridges, railway lines, trains, passenger trains, and canals were all targets. On the 24th of April alone, 400 French civilians would die in ruin from an American bomber raid. The French people were having an extremely miserable time. The statistics make for painful reading. 100% of the buildings in Saint-Nazaire were destroyed by Allied bombing, 96% of Tilly-les-Champins, 95% of Vire, and 88% of Villers-Bocage. This was light years ahead of any damage inflicted on England during the Blitz. On the 27th of May, 3,012 French civilians died in a single day from bombings. When all was said and done after the invasion, 60,000 French civilians had died from Allied bombing raids, and this is just the lowest and most mainstream accepted estimate. The true total was more than likely far higher. The French would hold bitter resentment over these bombings for decades to come. Meanwhile, back in the fatherland, the Allies were having a rough time, and Goering was claiming a rare victory in his defence of Germany. The time was used to increase production, and in April a whopping 1,859 new fighters and 1,500 armoured fighting vehicles had been produced. Hitler was over the moon. Magnificent, he said upon hearing the news. In the east, things weren't quite so rosy. Sevastopol was unable to hold, and the German troops were being evacuated in total disorder. Hitler stated that these troops were no longer fit to be soldiers. They could go and work in the arms industries, but as soldiers they had proved themselves to be failures, he said. The fall of Crimea, as noted with Turkey, was a huge coup for the Allies when it came to neutrals. On top of this, it made the situation regarding Romania and Hungary even more precarious too. The fall of the city had been a nightmare. Thousands had been killed whilst awaiting the ships on their way to evacuate them. In the 5-week battle for Crimea, 75,000 German and Romanian troops had perished, never mind the wounded and those who were captured. General Schörner, commander of Army Group South Ukraine, suggested that radical solutions should be implemented in Romania. A total clear-out was needed to ensure her defection did not take place. This included the much-hated German military attaché, Erich Hansen. By now, there was trouble in the south too. There had been a serious Allied thrust from the Anzio beachhead in the south of Italy. Field Marshal von Richthofen came to see Hitler on the 23rd of May, but the Führer seemed remarkably calm, at least in his eyes. Quote, 3 p.m, with the Führer. He's grown older, good-looking, very calm, has very definite views on the military and political situation, no worries about anything. Again and again one can't help feeling this is a man, blindly following his summons, walking unhesitatingly along the path prescribed to him, without the slightest doubt as to its rightness and the final outcome. The unpleasant military occurrences at Cassino, and since this morning, at the Anzio beachhead, are contemplated by him quite calmly. As he puts it, we can be thankful that we are still fighting so far down. After all, last September, we all thought, and he did too, that this summer would see us fighting in the Apennines, or even in the Alps, end quote. Hitler then went on to say that politically, Germany had actually already won the war a long time ago. He was coping, and he was to do more and more of this as the defeats racked up over the coming 11 months. On that same day, however, Hitler would receive some grave news. The Luftwaffe's aircraft specialists were brought in to speak to the Führer at the Berghof. At one point, the production of his beloved Me-262 jets were mentioned, although curiously, as a jet fighter. Hitler blurted out, quote, "Jet fighter? I thought the 262 was coming as a high-speed bomber," end quote. This had been one of the projects Hitler had been most excited for. He wanted to bomb the Allies off the beach with those lightning-fast jets if they landed. Yet now he was being told his orders had been defied, and it had instead been built as a fighter. Hitler completely lost his cool, and began to rage at the engineers in front of him. He told them that all the armour and cannons could be removed. All that did not matter. The jet simply had to be fast, so no matter how many enemy fighters there were to defend an objective, it would not matter, as the jet bomber would get there via pure speed. Goering continued on the next day to his men, quote, "You gentlemen appear to be stone deaf, the lot of you. I referred again and again to the Führer's order. He doesn't care two hoots about getting the Me-262 as a fighter. He wants it only as a bomber, and now suddenly it is impossible. The Führer says, for all I care, you can put the fighters on a bonfire. He wants an aircraft which can force its way through by virtue of its speed, despite the enormous mass of fighters that will be guarding the invasion forces. What no civilian dares to do, simply ignore orders. You gentlemen do time after time after time," end quote. By now, as we know, the invasion was only weeks away. The super weapons that Hitler had expected to be ready for the invasion were simply not, bar one. Concealed catapults had been stretched along the French coast, ready to fire the Luftwaffe's flying bombs across the channel as soon as the invasion started. Hitler had proudly boasted recently that London would be turned into a, quote, garden of ruins, the very moment the invasion began. Hitler ordered them to prepare for an attack in mid-June, which would be followed up by an attack on the English capital by bomber squadrons. Then, night after night, the flying bombs would continue to rain. The Führer said to his private staff, quote, Panic will break out in England. These flying bombs have such an unnerving effect that nobody can stand them very long. I'm going to pay those barbarians back for machine gunning our women and children and sacking our culture." End quote. Meanwhile, these barbarians were reaching the peak of their attacks in France. 3,000 French civilians died on May the 28th and 29th. Regardless of the excessive invasion preparations by the Allies, Hitler remained confident to the last. On the 4th of June, Hitler had said to Slovakian Prime Minister Father Tiso, quote, "If the British came to us now with any kind of peace feelers, I would prefer to tell them to keep their feelers until after the invasion." End quote. Others weren't so confident. An Africa Corps general had been repatriated back to Germany from Britain on health grounds, named General Hans Kramer, aged 47. He arrived at the Berghof and claimed that he had faked a lung complaint so convincingly that the British had been left with no choice but to send him back. Before doing so, however, the British had kindly shown him their invasion preparations. Kramer arrived with depressing news. He felt the Anglo-American invasion would be simply unstoppable. Operation Overlord's success was inevitable, he said. Obviously, many who were present saw the obvious. This was part of the Allied deception plans for the invasion. Hitler dismissed this claim, however, and simply stated, quote, "Whatever, the general is to see Field Marshal Rommel and tell him what he has seen." End quote. Kramer then went to see Rommel and assured him that the invasion was going to come on both sides of the Somme estuary, exactly where Rommel had imagined it would be. Rommel replied, quote, "They're not coming, and if they do, they won't make it off the beaches." End quote. In the days leading up to D-Day, Rome fell too. Irving explains, quote, "In Italy, now that the Anzio forces had linked up with the main battlefront, Rome could well become a battlefield, just as Stalingrad had. This produced another instance of Hitler's strange conception of morality. The same Führer who was indifferent to the fate of Jewish children was proud to have defeated Belgium without defiling Brussels, and France without attacking Paris, while his enemies had just bombed the ruined cathedral and destroyed, quite pointlessly, the famous monastery at Monte Cassino. As early as February, Hitler had turned down Kesselring's suggestion that in an emergency the Tiber bridges in Rome should be destroyed, as the river's steep embankments would check the most determined enemy's advance. Hitler had reiterated that Rome's status as an open city must be strictly observed. He might jest to Mussolini, "You and I are the most reviled men in the world," but he did not want to go down in history as the man who caused Rome to be destroyed. Therefore, Wehrmacht troops had been forbidden to set foot there, and even during the fiercest fighting at Anzio, all military transports had been tediously diverted around the outskirts of Rome. This forbearance brought no Allied response. When Kesselring formally suggested through the Vatican on June the 3rd that both sides continued to respect the open city, the Allies made no response, but instead appealed to the city's populace to join the battle. The British and American tanks penetrated to the very heart of Rome the next day. Hitler should now have blown up the bridges, but he did not. Late the next evening, June the 5th, 1944, Roosevelt broadcast news of victory. The American president attributed to the skill of his generals the fact that Rome had escaped damage. Hitler was unimpressed by the city's capture, telling Dr. Goebbels that same evening that the real decision would come if and when the Allies invaded France. The Germans had the loss of their air superiority to thank for their difficulties in Italy. Goebbels rather feared that they would face the same problems in the West. In an odd mood, Hitler ventilated the idea of allowing the Red Army into Romania to panic the Western powers. He considers Britain done for, Goebbels afterwards dictated, and is resolved to give her the coup de grace at the slightest opportunity. End quote. By early June, it was obvious that something was afoot. The Abwehr had penetrated the French resistance deeply by now, and knew full well that the BBC would alert them of the invasion by broadcasting certain two-part code phrases. Already by February, the Germans knew which phrases to listen for. On the 1st of June, the BBC broadcasted 125 of these half phrases, which led the Germans to believe that the invasion would take place in the next 2 weeks. The phrases, however, were only directed at the resistance cells in Brittany and Normandy. The German army in the west chose to ignore this critical piece of information regarding the location. Meanwhile, the weather was looking shoddy, and the forecast predicted as much. The last recon flight had shown barely any Allied transports at Dover, either. The rest of the south coast simply wasn't checked. The tides, too, seemed to be unfavourable for an amphibious landing, where Rommel expected it to be. The Field Marshal took all these signs to mean that he had time to head home for his wife's birthday on the 6th. He set off on the 4th. At 10 p.m. on the 4th of June, the BBC broadcast the second code phrase at 9:15 p.m, meaning that the invasion was imminent, within 24 hours most likely. The 15th Army was put on full alert. The next day, Rommel's Chief of Staff, Hans Speidel, a man who was involved in a certain plot that would take place the next month, decided that the 7th Army, the one guarding the Normandy coastline, shouldn't be informed. Speidel and his colleagues then stayed up to 1 a.m. getting drunk. Hitler went to bed around the same time, completely oblivious to the fact that 5,000 enemy vessels were currently heading for Normandy, the exact location he had predicted so steadfastly. By the time Hitler awoke on the 6th, it was essentially already too late. During the night, the news of parachute and glider landings grew thicker, and ships' engines could be heard offshore. At 4 a.m, Goebbels got this news at the Berghof and proclaimed, quote, "Thank God, at last, this is the final round," end quote. Hitler, however, was not woken up. Jodl told Hitler's adjutants that the uncertainty wouldn't be dispelled until daybreak. It took until midday for Hitler to awaken, realise what was going on, and reply to Rundstedt's appeals to release the panzer reserves for a counterattack. The Allies by this time had established a 15-mile wide beachhead that was 2 miles inland. The battle was already lost. They had not been swept off the beach as Hitler had been picturing in his head for the last year. The coast fell with but a whimper. Rommel, the man who had been proclaiming that he would sweep the Allies off the beaches himself, was meanwhile back in Germany for his wife's birthday. The battle for France was lost, but Hitler did not know it yet. Hitler certainly couldn't be blamed for such a defeat. Rommel had prioritised other areas than the one Hitler had requested the entire time. In fact, the Normandy section of the Atlantic Wall was only 18% complete, whereas the area Rommel and Rundstedt expected the Allies to land had been completed to the tune of 68%. The entire time, too, Hitler had been warning and warning and warning about Normandy. Nobody would heed his call. It was the Moscow and Italian fiasco all over again. Hitler was many things, but he certainly wasn't an idiot when it came to such scenarios. The intelligence had either been all wrong or simply hadn't reached Hitler as well. German intelligence drew the correct conclusions from the BBC's secret radio messages, yet Hitler was never informed. Intelligence reports suggested that there was 90 enemy divisions and 22 brigades under arms in Britain. The real number was 37. This led Hitler to stretch his forces out in case of a feint invasion, which never materialised. On the day of the invasion itself, Rundstedt was unable to admit that Normandy was 100% the actual invasion site, as he always had a second landing in the back of his mind from the overly inflated figures. Meanwhile on the battlefield, Allied air supremacy was absolutely overwhelming. It was something from another planet. This alone won the battle. The German reserves took an extremely long time to get to the front, and by the time they got there, they had already undergone a serious beating from the sky. The Luftwaffe could bring no reply of note. It was a massacre. At 2:30 p.m. on the first day, Hitler released the 2 divisions of panzer reserves. Throughout the entire first day, he remained supremely confident. He had met Keitel that morning by saying, quote, "The news couldn't be better. As long as they were in Britain, we couldn't get at them. Now we have them where we can destroy them," end quote. To Goering, he spoke in the same vein, quote, "They are landing here and here, just where we expected them," end quote. The signs, for anyone who actually wanted to see, however, were not good. The Luftwaffe ran 319 sorties in France on the first day. The Allies, on the other hand, ran 10,585. Regardless of this obvious fact, Richthofen wrote on the 7th of the Luftwaffe, quote, "The Channel fighting is assessed very optimistically by the Luftwaffe High Command," end quote. By the 8th, the message began to sink in. Goering had 800 crews available for fighter squadrons, but he had only 95 fighters operational against the invasion. There simply wasn't enough aircraft. Meanwhile, on the ground, the German counterattack utterly failed underneath the weight of total Allied aerial supremacy. A few days later, Guderian gave it to Hitler straight, quote, "Even the greatest bravery of the tank soldiers can't make up for the defection of 2 other services." On the 10th of June, Dönitz bitterly concluded, quote, "The invasion has succeeded, the second front has come," end quote. Whilst all this had been going on, the flying bomb attacks on London had been ordered to begin on the 6th. The next 6 days were spent getting everything ready at the launch sites. By the 11th, things weren't ready, but the OKV demanded that the attack begin the next night regardless. The attack began as planned on the 12th. The result, however, was a fiasco. 10 V-1 rockets were catapulted towards Britain. 4 crashed immediately, 2 vanished, 1 destroyed a railway bridge in London, and the other 3 landed harmlessly elsewhere. The Germans regrouped and tried again a few days later. On the 15th, 244 V-1s were again launched at the capital. This time, fires swept the city. Churchill was taken completely by surprise, and he immediately ordered massive gas attacks on German cities, which would have rendered vast swaths of Europe essentially uninhabitable for decades to come. Thankfully, his orders were refused, and level-headed individuals chose a more sensible path. The Allied bombing campaign now focused on the V-1 sites instead of civilian targets, aircraft production, or oil refineries. On the 16th of June, Hitler himself headed to the west by air. The Allied beachhead was somewhat contained, yet was getting more and more bloated, ready to explode. At his headquarters in Soissons, near where he had won his Iron Cross in the Great War, he met Rundstedt and Rommel with the goal of restoring their confidence. Both generals, however, had bad news. Rommel said that the Allied aerial and naval forces were simply too powerful. His troops, even boys as young as 17 and 18, who he described as young tigers, were fighting tooth and nail for every inch of land, yet this was simply no match for the overwhelming Allied supremacy. Rundstedt wanted to withdraw his forces back a little, and Hitler approved. A counterattack was to be set up in the meantime. Rommel wasn't so sure though, and he took Hitler aside during an air raid and said that, quote, "Politics would soon have to come into play, otherwise the situation in the West will deteriorate too far for salvaging," end quote. Hitler, however, snapped back, quote, "The time isn't ripe for a political decision," end quote. Back at the Berghof, Hitler got the news that the Americans were now at the west coast of the Cherbourg Peninsula. Rommel, however, had a new lease of confidence after having spoken with the Führer. He wrote glowingly that the 25 new enemy divisions which had just landed had taken heavy casualties. The local French population, too, was still overwhelmingly on the German side, which was a huge boon to the troops. On the 21st of June, Hitler got some less positive news. General Dietl, commander of the German 12th Army in Lapland, was that day's guest. The two spoke about Finland's future, which appeared to be laying outside of the Axis camp. In February, there had been secret Finnish-Soviet talks regarding an armistice, yet they had collapsed in March as the Soviets were pushing for terms which were too harsh. In April, Hitler stopped arms deliveries to Finland. The next month, Marshal Mannerheim promised him that these weapons would never end up in Russian hands. Hitler dismissed this comment as worthless, yet on the 10th of June, Hitler was greatly impressed by Mannerheim's dogged resistance against a Russian offensive. Hitler changed his mind, quote, "As long as the Finns keep warring, we'll support them. The moment they start jawing, the deliveries will be stopped," end quote. With Dietl, Hitler said that he was disappointed that Mannerheim had withdrawn some of his troops. Dietl, however, slammed his fist on the table and told Hitler he was acting like a chair-bound general. He then vowed to fly back to Finland and support Marshal Mannerheim to the hilt. He then marched out. Hitler remarked to his gasping staff, quote, "Gentlemen, that's the kind of general I like," end quote. The plane carrying Dietl and his other generals on the way back to Lapland a few hours later crashed, killing everyone on board. It was a death blow to relations with Finland, and very soon they would defect. There were other worse signs in the east too. The Soviet offensive was tearing the Germans to pieces, and permission for withdrawal after withdrawal was requested from the Führer. On the 30th, Zietzler arrived at the Berghof and demanded one of these. Hitler refused, stating that this would throw Finland into the arms of Stalin and deprive Germany of her nickel supplies. Zietzler then stated that the battle for France was lost and that the war could not be won. He said that only the appointment of Himmler as dictator would save the nation as he could implement total war. Hitler stated that Zietzler's nerve was gone, and then the general simply departed without saluting, and the next day he suffered a total nervous and physical breakdown. Hitler never saw him again, and for weeks Hitler had to operate without a chief of general staff. In the West, too, the generals were giving up. On the 1st of July, Rundstedt clearly stated that no counterattack would ever be possible. Hitler refused any withdrawal, though. He knew full well that if the Allies weren't crushed in their relatively small beachhead, then they would sweep into the open countryside of France unopposed, and the entire country would be lost. There was no alternatives between defeating them here and giving up France in general. He said to Rommel, quote, "The present lines are to be held. Any further enemy breakthrough is to be prevented by tenacious defence or local counterattacks," end quote. Rundstedt, on the other hand, was dismissed. Kluge took his place. As for the overwhelming enemy air supremacy, Hitler decided that essentially scrapping most bomber production was the solution. Germany needed fighters, and more fighters. Production was to be stepped up immediately, and he was optimistic. The armies just needed to hold on, in his mind, until these masses of fighters could be produced. There was a small positive for the Germans around this time. The Italian front had been halted after weeks of hard-fought retreats. General Koller wrote on the 3rd of July, quote, "The Führer explains just why we have to fight for every square metre of ground, because for us gaining time is everything now. The longer we can hold the enemy off at the periphery, the better. Perhaps the individual soldier or NCO may not grasp why he is asked to fight in the Abruzzi Mountains instead of the Apennines, but his supreme commander must understand why and comply, because the interests of Germany's fight transcend those of the individual soldier. Kesselring fears that he will be breached in his present position if he holds it too long, and he wants to fall back to the Apennine line early on, but the Führer wants that postponed as long as possible. The Führer again emphasises how enormously different the situation would be if we still had the air superiority we used to. We are going to win it back, at least partially, but for that we need time, and we must not give up ground before then," end quote. In the East, though, everything now began to fall apart. Irving writes of the catastrophe, quote, "In the East, the catastrophic eclipse of Army Group Centre was all but complete. At the midday conference on July the 6th, 1944, the Führer again rejected Modell's view that 4 divisions could be extracted from Army Group North by ordering its withdrawal. All that would happen, he said, was that the group would lose its fortified positions and its heavy guns and equipment. Turning to General Husinger, Hitler quietly asked what the disaster had cost them during the last 2 weeks in the centre, and was told, "The overall losses will run to 28 divisions. I don't mind saying," Hitler reminisced later, "it would be hard to imagine a graver crisis. When Field Marshal Model took over, Army Group Center was all gap. There was more gap than front, but then at last there was more front than gap." End quote. The cause of the disaster was multifaceted. Zietzler's strategy had been faulty, and the Luftwaffe was paralysed by fuel shortages. Most importantly of all, however, the majority of the leading army officers seemed to be weary of war. General Jodl was to say later, quote, "Practically the entire Army Group Center surrendered to the enemy this summer." End quote. As a result of the Eastern collapse, the Russians were soon enough at the very gates of the Reich in East Prussia. Hitler quickly called an urgent conference with Himmler, Speer, and other experts, and insisted on a number of new measures being taken. There were further conferences too. At one of them, Hitler noticed a colonel who had been at the Berghof a month prior. He seemed particularly fanatical for the Nazi cause. He had one eye, one arm, and 2 fingers missing from his other arm. This was General Fromm's chief of staff. On the 11th of July, the colonel was at the Berghof. He'd come to discuss some new blocking divisions that were meant to be rushed up to plug the gaps in the front. Himmler didn't arrive, however, and so the colonel left again. Meanwhile, the battle in the east was getting desperate, so Hitler himself headed out to his Rastenburg headquarters in East Prussia. The Battle of Vilna had begun, and the Führer felt that only he could turn the tide with his presence. Before taking leave, however, Hitler had a sudden horrible feeling that his life would soon be in danger. As he wandered through the Berghof with Eva Braun, he paused in front of all the familiar paintings, as if it was the last time he would ever see them again. He bid farewell to the ladies of the Berghof in much the same way. Frau von Bülow said to him, quote, "But mein Führer, you will be coming back in a week or two, won't you?" End quote. Hitler did not reply. In his absence, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia had undergone a total transformation. Upon touching down, thousands of Todt organization workers were sweating away, making the place into an impenetrable fortress. Bunkers littered the entire area, all of which had been carefully camouflaged using greenery. The war conferences were held in one of these bunkers, which had a 40-foot-long conference room installed inside of it. The Hitler of the 14th of July was not faring well. Morel noted, quote, "Influenza and conjunctivitis in both eyes. Shampoo got in his left eye, smarting badly." End quote. The Führer was given a cocaine adrenaline solution to numb the pain. As for other matters, Hitler had received a letter from Dr. Goebbels in which he complained of the under-exploitation of the Reich's manpower. Quote, "At this moment, with East Prussia preparing to defend her soil, every postal delivery in Berlin brings fresh invitations to official receptions, to parties, to games, or to displays." End quote. He continued on later, quote, "Give absolute power to one man you can trust for every problem requiring a rapid solution. Every time I see you, I look to see what your health is like. When you came to Berlin for the state funeral of General Hube, risking death from American fighter aircraft, I was shaking with fear. I confess, you alone, mein Führer, are our guarantee of victory." End quote. He pushed the point home, quote, "By calling all England to arms after Dunkirk, did Churchill thereby condemn her to die? And Stalin, when he proclaimed during our advance on Moscow, 'Better to die on your feet than live on your knees,' did he imperil the whole USSR?" End quote. Hitler saw the logic and agreed to implement Goebbels' vision of total war. Meanwhile in the east, Hitler had ordered a new defensive line built along the entire front. 15 new Grenadier divisions were being raised back in the Reich to fill in the gaps left from the earlier losses that year. Hitler wanted more urgency with this task, however, and so on the 15th he ordered General Fromm and his chief of staff, the colonel with one arm, to the Wolf's Lair. On the 19th, Hitler ordered 2 East Prussian divisions to be raised from the province's home guard. In relation to this, the colonel was again ordered to report to Hitler the next day. These new divisions were but one of many measures involved in shoring up East Prussia. A few days earlier, Hitler had ordered that all refugee families were to be stopped east of the new defensive line. The able-bodied members of the refugee horde were to be set to work on the fortifications. In the west, things were awful too. The Germans tasked with containing the bridgehead were being absolutely annihilated. This included General Rommel. On the 17th, Hitler got the news that the Field Marshal's car had been strafed by an Allied fighter plane. On the 18th, the city of Caen was hit by 2,000 Allied bombers. 2,000 French civilians perished in the ruins. In the south and north, too, things were bad. In the former, the Germans had pulled out of Livorno. In the latter, there were Danish communists waging partisan warfare, pretty much openly. In Hungary, too, there were bad signs. Horthy refused to deport his country's Jews, and instead stated that a general would bring Hitler a letter on the 21st of July. Hitler was absolutely overcome with stress. One incident on the 18th of July displays this. During a conference, there was a fly buzzing around the room which was irritating Hitler. One of his adjutants, SS Colonel Fritz Darges, was asked to deal with the annoying pest. Darges joked that since the fly was an airborne threat, Nikolaus von Bülow, the Luftwaffe adjutant, should deal with the problem. Hitler immediately lost it, took Darges aside, and dismissed him on the spot. On that same day, Hitler worried of trouble ahead. He stated to his secretary, Christa Schroeder, quote, "There is something in the air," end quote. On the 20th, Mussolini was expected to arrive after lunch. Hitler had wanted him to raise 4 new divisions for political reasons, but he had now changed his mind on the 19th. Mussolini was already on his way though, and Hitler felt unsure about seeing him. The train carrying the Duce was instead shunted around the East Prussian countryside to delay him. Hitler's usual 1 PM war conference was brought forwards to 12:30. The Führer then duly walked over to the conference hut at the appointed time, and all seemed normal. Everyone gathered around the table, and the talks began. Shortly afterwards, Keitel arrived with General Buller and the colonel with one arm who carried a yellow briefcase. Keitel announced, quote, "Mein Führer, this is Colonel Count Schenk von Stauffenberg, who is to brief you on the new divisions," end quote. Stauffenberg then threw up a salute with his left arm. Hitler shook the colonel's deformed hand, then got back to business as normal, sitting down on his wooden stool. Inside the room were 24 men. In Hitler's right hand he held a magnifying glass, and in his left he had a bunch of pencils. Suddenly, there was a bright yellow flash and an explosion erupted. Smoke filled the room, and the Führer found himself laying on the floor, covered with debris. He felt his hair and clothes were on fire. His right elbow was in grueling pain. Those around him screamed in pain, yet Hitler could not hear them. Their faces, contorted by pain, were visible, however. Men began to stream out of the room. The Führer worried that a Soviet power drop had begun, a worry that had plagued him and Himmler for a while now. He dared not jump out of the window in case he ran straight into enemy gunfire. He slowly rose and headed for the corridor, patting the flames off his trousers. Keitel, being the huge Prussian that he was, simply shook off the debris covering him and ran to support the Führer, leading him outside with Sonnleitner. Keitel remarked, quote, "Mein Führer, that must have been one of the Todd workmen," end quote. Hitler, however, disagreed, quote, "A German workman would never lift his hand against me," end quote. As Hitler stumbled into his personal bunker, he stated, quote, "I always sensed this opposition to me in the general staff. Stalin knew what he was doing when he rubbed out Marshal Tukhachevsky, but now I shall make a clean sweep," end quote. The Führer then called for Dr. Morell, who took his pulse. It was normal. Shortly afterwards, Hitler's secretaries arrived. Hitler said with a grin, quote, "Well, ladies, things turned out well again," end quote. The doctor duly continued with his job, and it turned out that beneath Hitler's shredded trousers, the lower third of both thighs had been badly torn. 100 splinters were removed from his legs. His hair had been singed, and his face was covered in cuts from splinters. His forehead had a scar from a falling roof timber too. At 1:15 PM, the Führer re-emerged. Others had not been so lucky. The man stood to his right. Colonel Heinz Brandt had lost a foot. He was laid on the grass outside the bunker, and joked stoically, "It always did hurt anyway." Korten had been impaled by a table fragment. Schmundt had horrific leg injuries and lost an eye. One of Hitler's stenographers, named Berger, had lost both of his legs. Hitler immediately had him appointed to a high civil service grade so his wife could draw a pension. He died later that afternoon. Christa Schroeder, Hitler's secretary, wrote of that day, quote, "I did not expect to be called in for lunch with him after the assassination attempt, but nonetheless, I was sent for to join him. I was astounded to see how fresh he looked, and how sprightly he stepped towards me. He described to me how his servants had reacted to the news. Ling was indignant. Arndt had begun to cry. Then he said, verbatim, 'Believe me, this is the turning point for Germany. From now on, things will look up again. I'm glad the Schweinhund have unmasked themselves.' I told him he couldn't possibly meet the Duce now. On the contrary, he reported, 'I must. What would the world press say if I did not?' End quote. At 2:30 the Duce arrived. Hitler greeted him warmly, quote, 'Duce, I have had the most enormous stroke of good fortune,' end quote. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. A corporal who had been operating the telephone outside the conference room told Bormann that he saw a one-armed colonel leaving the conference room in a hurry just after the explosion without his briefcase, his hat, or his belt. The man was brought before Hitler at once. Originally, army officers began to rage at this accusation against the aristocratic Stauffenberg. During the afternoon, however, the suspicion against him hardened. He had left in a hurry at 1:13 PM for Rangsdorf airfield in Berlin, yet he hadn't arrived there. In Berlin itself, strange rumours were flying. General Fromm called up Keitel at 4 PM and asked if he should declare a state of emergency. Keitel replied, quote, "The Führer is alive. There is no cause whatever for that. Is Stauffenberg in Berlin?" End quote. Fromm, flustered on the other end, was evidently taken aback. In Berlin, there was a special network that sent all the orders issued to the various German territorial army commands directly to Hitler's headquarters too. The conspirators had completely overlooked this fact, and the Wolf's Lair was able to monitor increasingly strange orders coming from Fromm's office to these commands. Commands had been sent proclaiming Field Marshal Irving von Witzelben as Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, and General Erich Huppner had been made Commander of Home Forces. It was immediately obvious what was going on. The forgotten army officers of years past, shunted off into retirement for their incompetence, were attempting a coup. Himmler was immediately given powers by the Führer for his Gestapo to arrest army officers. The Reichsführer set off for Berlin at once. There was one caveat, however. Hitler stressed that Himmler's Waffen-SS troops were not to come into direct confrontation with the army. That would do nothing but provoke an actual civil war. Whilst Himmler cleaned up the capital, Keitel handed the provinces. Thanks to his quick actions, the putsch was crushed outside the capital before it even began. At 4:15 p.m. a message went out to all the army commands, quote, "Most immediate, the Führer is alive, safe and sound. Reichsführer SS new commander of replacement army, only his orders valid. Do not obey orders issued from General Fromm, Field Marshal von Witzelben or General Hauptner. Maintain contact with local Gauleiter and police commander," end quote. The plotters acted too. General Beck was claiming to have taken over. A telegram was signed by Witzelben and Stauffenberg and sent to the army commands. They claimed that party leaders had staged a coup. They were simply putting it down and taking power. The telegram explained what was going on, in their fake version of events. Quote, 1. Internal unrest. An unscrupulous clique of combat-shy party leaders has exploited the situation to stab the hard-pressed armies in the back and seize power for their own selfish purposes. 2. In this hour of supreme danger, the Reich government has declared martial law to preserve law and order and appointed me Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht with absolute executive authority, end quote. The document then went on to state that the Waffen-SS would be incorporated into the army. The Gestapo would be eliminated, and that any opposition would be crushed ruthlessly. Soon afterwards, Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group Center, called the Führer. He had received an order stating that Hitler was dead, but he refused to believe it. Hitler then duly sent for his press chief and dictated a broadcast to the people. Quote, "A bomb attack made on the Führer today. Apart from minor burns and bruises, the Führer was uninjured. He resumed work immediately afterward, and as planned received the Duce for a lengthy conversation." End quote. Hitler was indeed talking to Mussolini as if nothing had happened. He rattled off the usual statistics from Speer's production machine and told the Duce about the upcoming V2 rockets. He stated that he would now raise London to the ground after August, September, or October. The new U-boats too, he said, would enter service shortly. At 5 p.m. the Führer sat down for tea with his staff in the headquarters mess. Hitler's adjutant was on the line from Berlin, where strange events were taking place. Streetcars had driven through the government quarter without stopping, and the area was being cordoned off by troops. At the same time, Goebbels called up his private line from Berlin. Major Otto Ernst Riemer, commander of the Guards Battalion, had been ordered to occupy the government quarter. "Has the army gone mad?" the doctor said. At 6 p.m. a new telegram was issued from the army commands from the plotters. It was signed by General Fromm, although Fromm hadn't actually signed it. The telegram stated that the army commands were to secure all communication stations and arrest all ministers as well as leading party and police officials. Back at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler felt he was losing control of events and called up Goebbels. He asked when his radio communication announcing his survival would be broadcast, and amazingly, the propaganda minister said that he was waiting until he had a suitable commentary to go along with it. Hitler lost it. Quote, "I didn't ask you for a commentary. I just want the news broadcast as fast as possible," end quote. At 6:28 p.m, the radio service was interrupted, and the broadcast went out. The people knew the Führer was alive. Hitler, meanwhile, continued to awkwardly dine with Mussolini, but his thoughts were elsewhere. At about 7 p.m, the Duce was ushered out of the door. They never met again. Almost the second Mussolini left, Goebbels was on the phone. Major Riemer was with him. He wasn't sure if the army or the propaganda minister were trying to overthrow Hitler. Hitler, still rather deaf from the explosion, shouted into the phone, quote, "Major Riemer, can you hear? Do you recognize my voice? Major Riemer, they tried to kill me, but I'm alive. Major Riemer, I'm speaking to you as your supreme commander. Only my orders are to be obeyed. You are to restore order in Berlin for me. Use whatever force you consider necessary. Shoot anybody who tries to disobey my orders," end quote. Riemer, a dedicated National Socialist and a particularly zealous one at that, immediately knew what he had to do, and indeed, until the day he died in 1997, he would steadfastly defend the Führer and his memory. Hitler continued to impatiently wait out events at the Wolf's Lair. His injuries began to show as the day went by. Morel wrote in his notes, quote, "Right forearm badly swollen, prescribed acid aluminium acetate compresses. A fusion of blood on right shin bone has subsided. On back of third or fourth finger of left hand there is a large burn blister. Dressed this. Occiput partly and hair completely singed. A palm-sized second-degree burn on middle of the calf, and a number of contusions and open flesh wounds. Left forearm has a fusion of blood on interior aspect and is badly swollen. Can move it only with difficulty. Told him to take 2 opladons and 2 tablespoons of brom nervicit before going to sleep," end quote. That evening when he dined with his secretaries, Hitler would remark, quote, "What cowards! If they had drawn a gun on me, I might still respect them. but they didn't dare risk their own lives. The idiots cannot even imagine the chaos there would be if the reins slipped out of my grasp. I'm going to make an example of them that will make anybody else think twice about betraying the German people." End quote. At 11:30 p.m, a radio truck arrived from Königsberg, and Hitler was able to address the nation. Some of it read, quote, "A minuscule clique of ambitious, unscrupulous officers of criminal stupidity have been plotting to get rid of me and to liquidate virtually the entire German Wehrmacht command staff at the same time. The bomb was planted by Colonel Count von Stauffenberg and exploded 6 feet away to my right. Several of my dear colleagues were injured. One has died. I myself am completely uninjured apart from a few minor scratches, bruises, and burns. I regard this as fresh confirmation of the mission given me by Providence to continue towards my goal." End quote. The speech was broadcast 90 minutes later. By now, Hitler had heard about Stauffenberg's lies, which had made this whole thing go ahead in the first place. He had claimed that he had, quote, "seen the Führer's corpse being carried past on a stretcher." End quote. Meanwhile, the arrest list continued to grow. In Vienna, Prague, and Paris, the plotters' orders had been carried out to varying degrees. In Paris, the Gestapo and SS chiefs had been arrested. Meanwhile, von Kluge had been implicated. General Reineck, a Hitler loyalist, had tried to call up General Fromm. On the other end, General Beck picked up the phone and said, "Kluge, is that you?" Later, Witzelben called up Keitel during the night from his hideout. The ever-loyal Keitel kept the plotter on the line whilst his location was discovered, and his arrest was quickly ordered. In the small hours of the morning, it became evident that the coup had been put down. A telegram from Fromm spelled out the end, quote, "Attempted putsch by irresponsible generals has been bloodily put down. All the ringleaders shot. I have resumed control, after having been temporarily held under armed arrest." End quote. Hitler didn't buy it. He ordered Fromm's arrest as well. At 3:40 a.m, Bormann celebrated victory with a telegraph to the Gauleiters, quote, "The traitor's action can be regarded as at an end." End quote. The Führer sent his burnt grey uniform jacket and black trousers to Eva Braun as a memento, and then tried to push the day's events out of his mind. He had a war to fight. Bad news arrived almost immediately regarding this war, however. A courier arrived with 2 letters, one from Kluge and one from Rommel. Both suggested that Hitler end the war. The troops in France were supposedly being hammered, and it was an unwinnable war according to the generals. Hitler, as usual, declined. France was Germany's last source of tungsten, and the entire basis of her U-boat campaign. If France was lost, it would be over. Regardless of Hitler's optimistic predictions regarding air supremacy and winning the Battle of France, he still ordered the upgrade of the West Wall fortifications on the border with Alsace-Lorraine on the 23rd. 2 days later, a new Allied offensive began in Normandy. Soon enough, the Americans had broken through. Hitler demanded his men make bigger and bigger sacrifices. The Allies had to remain contained. Hitler expressed his desire to head west and command events himself. Quote, "Obviously, if all the dams burst, I would do anything, I wouldn't care. I'd go as gunner in a single-engine plane to get there as fast as possible." End quote. Due to his damaged eardrum, though, he was forbidden to fly. Hitler was much more affected by the bomb than he liked to admit. Irving writes, quote, "His right ear often began to bleed. His eyes constantly flicked to the right. Alone in his bunker, he kept thinking he was falling over to the right. That evening, he went for a short walk in the twilight, and twice found himself wandering off the path. There was a constant taste of blood in his mouth." End quote. An army doctor arrived to see Hitler. He cauterized the ruptured eardrum, but it still bled. On the 24th, Hitler asked him to do it again regardless of the pain. A professor had told Hitler that perforating an eardrum was the most painful injury there was, yet Hitler didn't mind. Quote, "I stopped feeling pain long ago. Besides, pain exists to make a man out of you." End quote. Hitler remarked ominously later to Sonnleitner, quote, "I got both eardrums perforated, yet I didn't feel a thing. It happened so fast. That's probably how it is to shoot yourself too. Even if you shoot yourself in the mouth rather than the brain, I now know you don't feel a thing." End quote. After this, Hitler headed off to Rastenburg to see the other victims from the bomb blast. 2 beds were empty. Gunther Corden, chief of air staff, had died of his injuries on the 22nd, and Colonel Brandt had died the same day too. Corden was given a state funeral, but Brandt was not. In his delirium, Brandt had complained, asking why on earth Stauffenberg would plant the bomb at his feet when he, too, was one of the conspirators. More and more names began to flow in as well. Almost every section head of the Army General Staff was in on the plot. Zietzler's adjutant confessed as well. The 2 intelligence chiefs in the West, Colonels Hansen and Rohn, had been implicated too, which explained a lot of the intelligence failures there. The Army's Quartermaster General Edward Wagner had suddenly killed himself, which implicated him. The Director of Artillery, General Lindemann, had completely disappeared. The twice-appointed mayor of Leipzig, Karl Girdler, had vanished without a trace as well, and his hotel safe was searched, which revealed the fact that he was chosen as the man to replace the Führer. Also in his papers was a list of some of the conspirators, who were then hunted down and interrogated, which began a chain reaction of more and more names being implicated. The plot was far bigger than it had initially seemed. Other known opponents of Hitler were swept up in the chaos too. Admiral Canaris was taken in by the Gestapo, as was Franz Halder and Hjalmar Schacht. Bormann showed the Fuhrer the lengthy interrogation reports. They were ugly, and Hitler's feelings weren't spared. Hitler stated during the viewing, quote, "I must clean out this Augean stable with an iron broom, and there can be no mercy. How thankful I am to Riemer. A few more fine, clear-thinking officers like him, and I wouldn't have to worry about the future. But this yellow gang sends me an even more yellow-bellied Stauffenberg from Berlin. If he'd at least had the courage to stay there with his briefcase. But no, it was a pity to waste even one bullet on him. I keep asking myself what they were all after, as though Stalin or Churchill or Roosevelt would have been bothered one instant by our sudden desire for peace. In 8 days the Russians would have been in Berlin, and it would have been all over for Germany, for good." End quote. Hitler ordered Count Wolf von Helldorf, the chief of police in Berlin who had been part of the conspiracy, to watch every single last hanging until it was his own turn for the noose. Hitler was particularly aggrieved by this particular portrayal. He had lamented earlier, quote, "Who would have thought Helldorf was such a rat? That he was irresponsible was obvious enough from his gambling debts. How often I had to settle them for him? 4 or 5 times, and never less than 100,000 marks. A gambler like that was bound to fall into the hands of enemy agents, and the British Secret Service no doubt settled even bigger debts on his behalf. I'm sorry for his wife and pleasant children." End quote. Soon afterwards, a letter from Hitler's beloved Eva Braun arrived. The emotional letter ended, quote, "Right after our very first meetings, I promised myself I would follow you everywhere, even unto death. You know I live only for the love I can give to you." End quote. There were other signs of loyalty elsewhere too. The plot against their Führer had utterly united the German people in an iron determination to see out the war together, for better or for worse. A Viennese widow wrote into her Führer, quote, "I just heard the frightful news. Did nothing happen to you? Really? Mein Führer, you are all that is left in this world. I had a child, but he died in action in Russia at Maevka. He had passed his examinations and had a place waiting at technical college. I had been saving up for this, but now he'll never return. My darling child. Take my money, out of joy that nothing befell the Führer." End quote. Inside the letter was a lock of hair and a picture of the boy. Later on, Hitler was heard to remark that he might have been better off with Rome and his revolutionary SA army. Hitler didn't trust anybody now, but especially not the army top brass. He also often remarked how he thought Stalin had been right to launch his great purges. Just when Hitler thought it was all over though, 2 other names popped up who he never expected to see on the conspirators list: Field Marshals Kluge and Rommel. Hitler was so taken aback that he took 2 entire weeks to decide how to react to this new information. July may have been terrible for Hitler personally, but August was terrible for the war effort as a whole. There were positive signs too though, at least. Heinz Guderian stepped in as chief of the general staff the day after the coup attempt, and he immediately set about revitalising the Eastern Front, if that was even possible. He found the frontier defences in a neglected state, and immediately got to work on their renovation. Local Gauleiters were ordered to set up vast defensive positions in their domains. The orders were signed by Guderian under Hitler's name, which the Führer grumbled about, but he let it go regardless. Soon enough, from north to south, there were hundreds of thousands of men and women contributing to the defence of their homeland. In Pomerania alone, 70,000 women volunteered for the task. The ancient fortress cities of Königsberg and Lützen were soon covered with minefields and captured guns. Hitler's presence in East Prussia began to get around by word of mouth, and the people felt that together they were standing firm with their Führer. The result was a miracle. The Soviet horde was stopped at the gates of East Prussia. Field Marshal Model's battered, bruised and undertrained army group centre of 40 divisions managed to withstand the weight of 1/3 of the entire Soviet army along a 400-mile front line. On the 1st of August, the Poles rose in revolt in the infamous Warsaw Uprising when the Soviet armies were visible across the river. It was an act of national suicide. Himmler recognised this too. He said to Hitler, quote, "Mein Führer, viewed historically, what the Poles are doing is a blessing. We'll survive the next 5 or 6 weeks, but by then Warsaw, the capital, the brains, the nerve centre of this former 16 or 17 million strong nation of Poles, will have been wiped out. This nation that has barred our passage to the east for 7 centuries and lain foul of us ever since the first Battle of Tannenberg." End quote. A brutal struggle against the partisans ensued, with Warsaw being absolutely razed in the process. It was the scene of horrific events, such as those of the Dirlewanger Brigade, who slaughtered pretty much everything in their wake, be it man, woman, or child. The Poles themselves were well led. General Komorowski rejected every demand to surrender, despite the dawning realization that the Russians across the river were deliberately not coming to their aid. On the 21st of September, Himmler exclaimed, quote, "I wish we had a multitude of men like General Bohr." End quote. The Reichsfuhrer SS ordered that Bohr be treated well when the last insurgents surrendered 10 days later. Most of his fellow countrymen would not be so lucky. Meanwhile in the north, Army Group North was cut off as the Soviets reached the Gulf of Riga. The Army Group had been betrayed. On the 20th of July, the plotters had issued an order to the Army Group's Chief of Staff for an immediate retreat. Now, however, General Schörner's troops fought heroically. He complained in a private letter to Hitler, quote, "The Bolsheviks grow more useless every day. Prisoners on recent days range from 14-year-olds to old men, but what is astounding is the sheer hordes of human beings," end quote. The North was prepared for a bitter defence. All over the front line there was issues regarding captured Germans working for the Soviets, coaxing their countrymen to surrender. To prevent this, the Personnel Branch of Army Group North recommended that families of German traitors be punished as a deterrent. Hitler approved the recommendation. In the south, the situation was dire. Army Group South Ukraine had been routed in April and was now on Romanian soil. General Schörner blamed General Hansen, military liaison to Antonescu. Guderian described Hansen as a man of General Beck. Antonescu trusted him, however, and pleaded his case, so he remained. Other issues plagued Romania too. Their nation was soon to be a battleground, but more importantly at the moment, the nation was in economic chaos as a result of the war. German-Romanian relations were, by now, incredibly strained. Hitler knew how important Romania was though, and he'd told General Gerstenberg, Luftwaffe commander near the Ploiest oil fields, quote, "We are staking all we've got. If we lose the oil regions, we cannot win the war," end quote. He had used this line before in France, yet the war was still ongoing. Guderian had removed 6 panzer and 4 infantry divisions away from the south, and Antonescu came to Hitler's headquarters to protest on the 5th of August. The discussion was heated and lasted for hours. Hitler claimed that he had a new superweapon explosive, which would kill everyone within 2 miles of impact. It was in the experimental stage, he said. Hitler had previously promised to hold Crimea and Ukraine, yet he blamed the fact that these hadn't come true on the traitors in the General Staff. Antonescu left unconvinced, but he remained utterly devoted, as he always had been and would be. Before leaving he said that, quote, "He would remain at Germany's side and be the last country to abandon the Reich," end quote. As Antonescu's column of cars departed, Hitler suddenly had a thought come to him and stepped forward and shouted out, quote, "Antonescu, Antonescu, on no account set foot inside the king's castle," end quote. Antonescu stopped the car to hear better, and Hitler repeated himself, "Don't go into the king's castle." Hitler trusted the shifty King Michael of Romania about as much as he did any other monarch, and he suddenly had a bad feeling. It had come to him on the spot. Hitler and Antonescu would never see each other again. Back on the home front, however, Himmler had worked wonders. General Fromm had grudgingly raised 60,000 new soldiers a month for the People's Army, or Volksgrenadier divisions. These new units would be untainted by the spirit of the older generation, and was meant to appeal to the youth. When Himmler stepped up to the task, however, by mid-August, he had raised 450,000 new troops, with 250,000 more recruits on their way. On the 4th of August, the Gauleiters came to see Hitler. Helmut Sundermann, deputy press chief, wrote, quote, "The speech's beginning was delayed a bit, as the Führer ordered the prepared desk to be removed. He had a small table and chair brought, sat down and began to speak so softly at first that I had difficulty hearing from the back row. Then his voice rose rapidly. I always knew that shots would be fired at me one day from this quarter, but I never dreamed the blow would be struck so far below the belt." He said that he was now old and shaky, not because of his fight against Germany's enemies, but because of the perpetual conflict with this clique which always eluded me. This numerically small but highly influential group would have been totally incapable of any real political achievements, as they were wholly out of touch with the broad public. Now we were in the position of somebody who had been poisoned. If he could surmount this crisis, then we would not be dead, but in superb health. Although he had spoken virtually nothing of substance, his speech had an obvious impact on the Gauleiters. As the senior man present, Heerl spoke a few words of thanks to the Führer. "There is only one kind of loyalty. There is no loyal, more loyal, loyalist. There is only loyal, and that says everything," end quote. Irving writes of Hitler's health at the time, quote, "The Führer's insomnia had returned. Though he might scoff at Stauffenberg's bungling, the injuries remained very painful. Morell's treatment of his right elbow had resulted in dermatitis and pruritus, which left it so swollen that he could not sign documents. When unsuspecting frontline generals heartily grasped his right hand, he winced at the pain. Morell was also injecting massive doses of ultraseptal, a sulfonamide-type drug of high toxicity, and an oxygen bottle now stood hissing in one corner of Hitler's bunker room. At 2 a.m, sent for patient A, Morell had recorded on July 24th, 1944. He complained about the burns on his arm, the thick alcohol-soaked dressing, inflammation, and swellings. 3 days later, Ear still bleeding at times, Führer talked about letting some blood, but his blood pressure was normal. And on July the 29th, note that since the moment the bomb blast occurred, the tremor has vanished from his leg, and the trembling of his hands is down to a minimum. As Hitler complained of a throbbing pain over his right eye on August the 2nd, Morale drained off 200 cc of his patient's blood to lower the pressure. End quote. In the West, the Americans had broke out and were streaming into Brittany. Hitler suggested a countermove. Quote, "We must strike like lightning. When we reach the sea, the American spearheads will be cut off. Obviously, they are trying all out for a major decision here, because otherwise they wouldn't have sent in their best general, Patton. The more troops they squeeze through the gap, and the better they are, the better for us when we reach the sea and cut them off. We might even be able to eliminate their whole beachhead. We mustn't get bogged down with mopping up the Americans that have broken through. Their turn will come later. We must wheel north like lightning and turn the entire enemy front from the rear." End quote. The order for the attack was issued on the 2nd of August. 8 of the 9 panzer divisions in Normandy were to be involved, as well as 1,000 fighter planes. Everyone was hopeful for the attack. After all, it seemed entirely logical and reasonable, but as always, the Germans hadn't gambled on one thing. The British codebreakers had been far ahead of the game for years now. Anything the Germans planned was known in advance. Kluge suggested acting now before the fighters arrived, as he could clearly see that the enemy were pre-warned and preparing for his attack. Kluge trusted in his instinct and went ahead with the attack. The result was a fiasco, and the Germans came under heavy enemy air attacks. Hitler stated, quote, "The attack failed because Kluge wanted it to fail." End quote. Back at headquarters though, someone else was taking the blame, the Luftwaffe. Göring hadn't been seen since the 23rd of July and hadn't given Hitler a successor to the chief of staff who was fatally injured in the bomb blast. Until a new man was appointed, General Karl Koller bore the brunt. Göring simply laid in bed, depressed. Koller lamented in his diary, quote, "At every conference the Führer rants on for hours on end about the Luftwaffe. He strongly reproaches the Luftwaffe. The reasons are our lack of aircraft, technological shortcomings, and non-completion of the replacement squadrons in the Reich, the Me-262, etc." End quote. Only on the 11th of August was the new Chief of Staff, General Werner Kriep, introduced to Hitler. In his diary, Kriep wrote, quote, "The Führer has become very bent, with cotton wool in his ears, and he frequently trembles uncontrollably. One must not shake his hand too violently. First, the Führer asked me about my career, then spoke at length on the origins of what he called the collapse and failure of the Luftwaffe, primarily the errors of the Reichsmarshal's technical advisors, who had made over-hasty promises about the quality and quantity of new aircraft types. The air staff had probably also been deceived, and through negligence or ignorance made false statements to him on which he had unhappily based his decision. He mentioned Milch, Udet, and Jeschenek in this context." End quote. Kriep duly swore to tell Hitler the unfiltered truth during his time in the position. Days after Kluge's failed attack in the West, France began to fall. The Anglo-Americans were streaming out across the country, and the Germans were being slaughtered. Hitler's former adjutant, Hans Pfeiffer, died in a blazing tank, and Hans Junger, the SS captain husband of his younger secretary, was killed by a strafing Spitfire. Hitler had to break the news to Traudl Junger personally, and it broke his heart. Field Marshal Kluge was meanwhile acting inexplicably. He was holding his panzer forces way too far north. On the afternoon of the 14th of August, Himmler brought Hitler firm proof that Kluge and Rommel had indeed been part of the anti-Hitler plot. That same evening, the invasion of the south of France began in the French Riviera. The next day, the 15th of August, was the day that Hitler would later call the worst day of his entire life. The Americans began their attack on the Falaise pocket, and Field Marshal von Kluge had simply disappeared. His radio truck had been silent since 9:30 that morning. The worst was assumed, that he was negotiating the surrender of the entire Western Front. Hitler remarked a few days later, quote, "To change our destiny by surrendering to the British and joining forces against Russia, what an idiotic notion," end quote. Hitler didn't sleep at all that night. Kluge was still missing at the end of the day. The next day, the 16th, he suddenly learned that Kluge had arrived in the middle of the Falaise pocket the previous evening. Hitler didn't trust him and radioed, quote, "Field Marshal von Kluge is to leave the danger area immediately for 5th Panzer Army HQ, from which he is to direct the withdrawal movement," end quote. Field Marshal Model was secretly appointed as Kluge's successor. He was then sent to meet Kluge with a sealed letter ordering him home. On the 17th, Model arrived. 3 days later, the main forces of the Falaise pocket managed to escape the pocket against all odds. Kluge, meanwhile, returned to his native village, but in a coffin. On the 19th, he had died of a cerebral hemorrhage, according to the army doctors. A second army autopsy done on Hitler's orders revealed the same conclusion. Things didn't add up. On the 7th, Kluge sent his son into the pocket, lamenting, quote, "Let nobody accuse me of sparing my son and heir," end quote. On the 8th, he had been seen moaning over a battle chart, quote, Avranches. This town has cost me my reputation as a soldier. I'll go down in history as a Benedek of the Western Front. I did my best, but that's fate for you," end quote. Hitler ordered his SS doctors to look into it. Kluge's death was to remain a state secret, whilst the third autopsy took place. Hitler now saw the return of General Kramer from earlier that year in a more ominous light. The British had sent him to establish contact with the plotters, he thought. The Führer said, quote, "The British have announced that they were in contact with a German general. The officer, who was probably the go-between, has effectively been arrested for other reasons already. That was the man who was to set this thing, in these people's view, of capitulating, if possible, to the British, and then marching with the British against Russia. A totally idiotic concept," end quote. No proof was found on Kramer, and by mid-August the proceedings against him were dropped. Hitler ordered 2 more investigations. Both came to naught. Regardless, the British records indicate that they did keep asking new batches of prisoners about Kramer and his fate, yet nothing was entirely ever proven. By the 18th, the Americans were 36 miles from Paris. The Germans began to head out towards the German frontier in disarray. Meanwhile, grim reports came back from Paris on the moral decay within the army after 4 years of occupation. 4 years of loose French women and wine had taken its toll. Meanwhile, the Führer acted swiftly, and plans were drawn up for a great counter-offensive in November. 25 divisions were to be raised and equipped for the purpose. The offensive was delayed, but this was the birth of the Ardennes offensive. Bormann, meanwhile, blamed the Luftwaffe for the West, and he began to stick his nose in. A dossier was created on the Air Force. Irving explains, quote, "Bormann initiated a Luftwaffe scandals dossier to which the Gauleiters contributed profusely. Bombs had been shunted out of bomb-proof stores to make room for contraband from Italy and Greece. At Rechlin, the main experimental airfield, a technician tipped off Bormann that a villa was being built for the commandant at Lake Ammersee at Luftwaffe expense, and that Luftwaffe workmen were flying down to Bavaria each weekend to finish the job. Goering's sacked deputy, Milch, was accused of having fostered bad aircraft and aero-engine projects for the sake of old Lufthansa business cronies. Small wonder that Hitler compared Goering unfavourably with Himmler, and remarked on how the latter had conjured up new battalions for the army. General Kriep could not even find out how many men there were in the Luftwaffe. Hitler began to think of dissolving the entire Luftwaffe. On August the 17th, he telephoned Kriep and instructed him to replace Field Marshal Sprell, the fat Luftwaffe commander in France, by General Desloch. It was typical of Hitler to have delayed this decision until now, when it was too late. The first Me-262 jet bomber squadron was still to enter service. Goering, Kriep, Speer, and Garland all wanted the Me-262 used as a fighter. The bomb-proof oil refineries would not begin operating until March 1945, but by December, the OKV fuel reserve would have been consumed, end quote. On the 20th of August, the Red Army launched its offensive on the Romanian frontier. Within 3 days, the Sixth Army was basically encircled. Hitler, however, was focused on the west. In Paris, partisans had risen up against the garrison, and Hitler ordered them put down brutally. Quote, "In all history, the loss of Paris has meant the loss of France. Inside the city, the first signs of revolt are to be harshly put down, e.g., by blowing up entire street blocks, by public execution of the ringleaders, or by evacuation of any districts involved, as only this will stop things getting out of hand. The Seine bridges are to be prepared for demolition. Paris must not fall into enemy hands, or if it does, then only as a field of ruins," end quote. In the Balkans there was fresh news too. There had been a reapproachment between General Nedic, Prime Minister of Serbia, and Mihailovic, leader of the Chetnik monarchist partisans. They proposed to unite and work together with the Germans against Tito's partisans, if Hitler would provide them with necessary ammunition of 3 million rounds. They also demanded that they be allowed to raise an army of 50,000 men from the Chetniks. Field Marshal Weichs proposed that a slightly modified version be accepted. Hitler accepted the logic, but only on a smaller scale. Relying on, and arming, other nations was growing tiresome. He feared the Serbs as the only competent ethnic group in the Balkans. Quote, "The Serbs are the only eternally consistent people in the Balkans. They alone have the strength and the ability to keep pursuing their pan-Serbian aims," end quote. On the 23rd, Hitler's lack of trust in his allies was proven correct. He received a phone call from his man in Bucharest, Baron von Killinger, saying that strange things were going on. Marshal Antonescu had been summoned to the royal palace and hadn't returned. Hitler lamented, quote, "Why on earth didn't he listen to me?" end quote. Soon enough, King Michael was broadcasting to his nation, quote, "The Romanian government has accepted the armistice offered by Russia and the United Nations," end quote. The young king ordered his forces not to open hostilities with the Germans, but it was obvious that he knew this was a nothing order. German forces were all over his country, and neither side were just going to magically let Romania be as it was. The king had just signed his own nation's death warrant. Later that evening, Hitler gave orders to General Friesner to seize the oil fields and planned ways of getting the oil into Germany. Meanwhile, every German serviceman in the nation was placed at his disposal, and General Hansen was to put down the putsch. The 5th Flak Division at Ploiest was to put down Michael's coup in the capital. Admiral Brinkmann would seize the port of Constanta. A pro-Nazi Romanian general was to be appointed head of government. At 2 a.m. the next morning, a war conference began in which Hitler decided to abandon Greece the moment the enemy attacked. The Bulgarians were probably hours away from defecting, he said, so he needed to be ready further north. At 3:30 a.m. the news in Romania wasn't good. Gerstenberg radioed in from Ploiest, quote, "Fought my way out and took command in Ploiest together with SS General Hoffmeyer," end quote. Hansen and Killinger had given up hope already, and the idea of putting down the coup was drifting away. At 4:30 a.m. their message came through, quote, "There is no putsch by some court camarilla, but a well-laid coup d'etat from above with the complete backing of the army and people," end quote. Not a single pro-German Romanian general had been found. General Antonescu, by his loyalty alone, had been holding the country together in the Axis camp. The message finished, quote, "Given the balance of forces, there is at present no prospect of a military or political success," end quote. Regardless of this defeatism, the flak troops from Ploiest had pushed right up to Bucharest's northern outskirts by midday. Bombing attacks were called in on the city centre, but the Germans were outnumbered 4-1. Tanks and artillery were on their way, and the approach roads were mined. The odds looked grim. The radio station was captured, but by then the Germans could go no further. The next day, the Romanians used the bombing as a pretext to declare war on Germany. In the ensuing chaos, 16 German divisions were wiped out. Finland, Bulgaria, and Hungary all began a mad rush for the exit. Everything was imploding. Despite all this, Hitler remained confident. A young SS captain wrote down his first impressions from a Hitler conference on the 27th of August. Quote, "I am filled with the most ineffable admiration of him. He is unique as a man, as a politician, as a military commander. He radiates such a comforting calmness, but more than once I have heard him speak harshly, and each occasion was when on purpose, or sometimes out of ignorance, less than the full and brutal truth had been spoken, or even an outright lie. He seems to sense it at once. It is enormously impressive for me. What astounds me again and again is the radiance emanating from the Führer. I have seen the highest ranking officers come to report laden with problems and worry. They always leave his presence full of new confidence and hope," end quote. Back in Berlin this whole time, the trials had continued against the traitors. Hitler rebuked the judge, quote, "He is behaving like a harm actor, instead of getting the trial of these common criminals over as quickly as possible," end quote. The hangings were filmed, but the Führer refused to see them. When Fegelein showed Hitler the photographs of the naked corpses, Hitler tossed them aside. He then ordered Himmler to provide monthly subsistence payments to the next of kin of the deceased. He said he didn't want a repeat of the hardships experienced by the next of kin of those killed in the Night of the Long Knives. Meanwhile, on the 25th of August, Paris fell with barely a whimper. There was no heroic defence of the kind Hitler was expecting. Word came back to the Führer of the sheer corruption and decadence going on there. In one area, Luftwaffe men had sped past fleeing troops in trucks filled to the brim with French girls, stolen furniture, and other loot. As the Luftwaffe was busy stealing, enemy fighter planes massacred the columns of fleeing troops. Hitler raged and sent an immediate order to his viceroys, quote, "Our military and civilian authorities are often living irresponsibly and opulently, without the slightest warlike preparations, sometimes even surrounded by their families and female employees. Defeats at the front, coupled with uprisings in the cities, result in their being paralysed the moment a crisis breaks out. The upshot is that our troops are witness to a panic-stricken headlong flight, encumbered by a disgraceful load of German and alien womenfolk and their own or other people's ill-gotten goods, streaming across the countryside. Nothing is more likely to tarnish the image of these German authorities, and thus of the Reich, in the eyes of our troops and foreign populations," end quote. Hitler continued to seethe over the loss of France. At one conference, an SS general had spoken privately to the Führer, quote, "Mein Führer, I just don't understand. I was at Avranches with my own division and an army division. We had no enemy ahead. We could smell the sea, but we weren't allowed to attack. I said our attack was bound to succeed, but Field Marshal Kluge told us headquarters had forbidden it. We could have avoided this whole stinking mess if we had been allowed to press on," end quote. Hitler glanced at Sonnleitner and said, quote, "See, it was treachery, pure and simple," end quote. On the 20th of August, the report came in from Kluge's autopsy. He had killed himself with cyanide after all. The Field Marshal had also written a farewell letter to the Führer. As it turned out, too, Kluge had indeed tried to go to the front to contact Allied commanders to surrender the whole of France, but he couldn't get in touch with any of them. Whilst men like Kluge had given up, Hitler had not. Quote, "We shall fight on, if need be, on the Rhine. Where matters not the least to me. Come what may, we will keep fighting this fight until, as Frederick the Great once said, one of our accursed enemies tires of the struggle, end quote. On the 30th of August, Ribbentrop submitted a memorandum to Hitler requesting permission to put out peace feelers. Hitler, however, was still in no mood to do so. The next day he would say, quote, "I have always said the time is not ripe for a political decision. I need hardly add that I won't let a suitable opportunity pass, but obviously it is infantile and naive to look for a favourable political initiative at a moment of grave military defeats," end quote. Hitler stated that he was waiting for the opportune moment to make peace when the enemy camp might come into troubles with each other. It appeared he might be correct, as on the 2nd of September, Field Marshal von Weichs cabled stating that British officers were asking for a meeting where they could coordinate the evacuation of Greece, so that the Brits could get there before the Communists filled the vacuum. Communist plans had already been seized, showing that they planned to seize the key points there before the Brits could, yet Hitler refused to cooperate with the Brits in this regard. When the Germans actually withdrew from southern Greece in reality though, the British made no attempt to fill the void. Hitler took this as a sign that Stalin had been handed over the entire Balkans. He wanted to let the Allies have the full taste of communist repression in newly liberated areas to create a rift between the two camps. Quote, "It is politically desirable to foment trouble between communists and nationalists in every region we abandon," end quote. There were signs that Stalin, too, was thinking along similar lines as Hitler imagined. By way of Japan, extremely clear hints arrived showing that Stalin did not want to totally crush Germany, as he would need their industrial expertise for a war with the West. Supposedly, this was why the Russians had stopped short of the 1940 Soviet borders, and why Stalin had not been terror-bombing German cities. The telegram from Tokyo read, quote, "Stalin is evidently willing to conclude a peace treaty, even with a National Socialist Germany under Adolf Hitler," end quote. It sounded a little far-fetched, but this was the news that was reaching Hitler. Guderian agreed with Hitler though. Germany certainly had an opportunity here if they could hold on for a few more months. A bargain could perhaps be struck in the east. Late the previous month, the encircled Army Group North had hacked their way through, and General Schörner came to see Hitler to ask permission to abandon Estonia. Hitler refused. A few days later, however, the Finnish talks with the Soviets were leaked, and it became apparent that Bulgaria, too, was planning to defect, along with Hungary. Hitler's health was going down the drain as well, and he reached new lows. His arm was far from healed after the blast, and he now had new sinus headaches that kept him awake night after night. To ease the pain, Erwin Giesing began to give him a mild cocaine treatment, which immediately brought Hitler a relief, but the reaction, as expected, was harsh sometimes. Once Hitler had to hold onto a table for 90 seconds straight in order to not fall over, and things went black in front of his eyes. Regardless, Hitler kept asking for more and more of the drug. He teased the doctor, quote, "I hope you aren't making an addict out of me," end quote. Ultimately though, Hitler's priorities were elsewhere. He said to the doctor, quote, "But what does my health matter when the entire nation's existence is at stake?" end quote. By now in the West, Brussels and Antwerp had fallen in early September. Model grimly reported that the Allies had 2,500 tanks against less than 100 German ones in the West. The Luftwaffe weren't helping at all either. There simply wasn't any air cover. Hitler's V-1 flying bomb sites had been overrun in France, but launches continued from bomber aircraft. London was feeling the pressure. In one suburb alone, 20,000 houses a day had been severely damaged by flying bomb explosions. The British government reluctantly admitted that 450 aircraft and 2,800 flying personnel had been lost fighting against this weapon. Now Hitler took it to a new level, and the V-2 rockets began setting off from the Netherlands. On the 8th of September, the first of these superweapons came crashing into London. By now, Hitler was sick of the Luftwaffe. He said to General Kriep on the 3rd, quote, "I am considering disbanding the Air Force altogether and tripling the anti-aircraft artillery instead," end quote. Kriep recorded the Führer's complaints in his diary, quote, "Führer spoke first, a tirade against the Luftwaffe. No good, gets worse year after year. He was lied to permanently about production figures, and also about aircraft performances. Absolute collapse in France. Ground staff and signal troops had left their airfields in headlong flight to save their own skins, instead of helping the army to fight." Again, the question of Me-262 operations was ventilated. The same arguments as to why only high-speed bomber can be considered. In milder form, he again developed his idea of manufacturing only Me-262s in the future, while tripling the anti-aircraft artillery instead. Our fighter designs were all wrong. What we need to fight the 4-engined bombers are heavy twin-engined fighters and large-caliber armament. At the Reichsmarshal's request, Colonel Boom Tettelbach, who had commanded a fighter squadron, was called in. From his own experience, he explained why even heavy fighter aircraft with fighter escorts were not the best way of combating heavy bombers. Böhm-Tettelbach was rudely sent packing, end quote. Regardless of all these issues, the rout slowly began to halt along the German and Belgian frontier. The Netherlands held. The local Gauleiters in these areas told Bormann that the military headquarters were now setting themselves up in luxury hotels and chateaux. Hitler stepped in with an order that the generals were to house their staffs in the most humble accommodation possible. Also, just like in East Prussia, the German population got to work making fortifications in their hundreds of thousands. Factories began to churn out hundreds of thousands of Panzerfausts to deal with the enemy invasion, alongside the extra tanks, artillery, and ammunition Hitler needed for his upcoming counterattack in the winter. During this time, Hitler's doctors forced him into hours of inactivity. Hitler, however, wasn't one to sit idle. It was during this enforced inactivity that he cooked up his new strategy for the counterattack, which was far more audacious than the former plan. On the 12th of September, he called for Jodl, whom he asked to bring a map. On a white bedspread, they unfurled the map, and Hitler explained that he wanted to strike through the Ardennes and seize Antwerp as soon as winter hit. The SS were to be given the task. The army had by now proved themselves to be both unreliable and decadent in the West. A new Panzer army was created in Germany, and the ever-loyal Sepp Dietrich was put in charge. The decadence of the army was even visible just by looking at the conspirators. General Fromm regularly flew out for hunting parties, sending his empty Mercedes ahead by road. All of them seemed to have able-bodied soldiers working petty household jobs or guarding their bomb-damaged homes. Stauffenberg himself used to have his army chauffeur drive him 100 miles a day or more on random holidays during a fuel crisis. His home was full of black market alcohol and other luxuries. By now the fight was on German soil, and the first battle for a big German city began in Aachen. On the 16th, a secret message was issued to Hitler's commanders. It was to be passed on by word of mouth only. Quote, "The fighting in the West has now spilled over into German soil. German towns and villages will become battlefields. This fact must instill fanaticism into our fight, and spur on every able-bodied man in the combat zone to make a supreme effort, so that every pillbox, every city block, every village becomes a fortress against which the enemy bleeds to death, or which entombs its defenders in the man-to-man fight. No longer will this be a war of movement, but the choice between holding the line and annihilation." End quote. In the east, Army Group North was under attack again, and once more, Schörner came to Hitler asking to withdraw from Estonia towards Riga. Hitler was reluctant, and said that he needed Estonia as a bargaining chip, as the Soviets had put out feelers. He himself had put out counter-feelers, but the Russian intermediary simply didn't show up to the meeting. On the 18th, Hitler let Schörner withdraw after all. On September the 17th, the Allies' next move in the West was made. Instead of a direct assault on the West Wall, the Allies tried to go around via Holland. A sudden airborne assault had taken place on key bridges in the Netherlands, whilst armoured spearheads plunged forward to try to cross in time. Some of the aims included cutting off Hitler's troops up north in the Netherlands, and most importantly, to capture the V2 sites near The Hague. In Arnhem, the area was basically undefended. It wasn't in the German combat zone, and the town's commandant had died in an air raid the same morning, leaving his elderly operations officer in charge. In the one defence unit, every single one of the men were World War I veterans. Each man was given a captured gun and 20 rounds before being sent off to defend the city and its bridge. Against them was 10,000 of the best equipped paratroopers in the world. They had to hold off until help arrived. The elderly operations officer, Major Ernst Schlieffenbaum, recalled weeks later, quote, "When Field Marshal Model came on the telephone and said, 'You are responsible to me for holding Arnhem,' I felt quite faint, until the old seagull and nerves came to my aid. We old folks still have a thing or two in us yet." End quote. On that same day, the entire Allied battle plan was captured from a downed glider. Arnhem held. The Brits fell back towards Nijmegen, leaving behind 1,000 dead and 6,450 prisoners. Around this time though, the night raids once again began. Königsberg was reduced to ruins, and in one attack on Darmstadt, 12,000 died in half an hour, burned alive in the ensuing firestorm. For Arnhem and this, Göring came under fresh scrutiny. Hitler could barely believe how incompetent the Luftwaffe was. He even stated that some of the Luftwaffe units had retreated back past the Rhine River. On the 19th of September, Hitler went for a head x-ray at the hospital. After all 3 x-rays were completed, he shook hands with the Catholic nursing sisters, and then asked his doctor to take him to the wards where the victims of July the 20th were. General Schmund was there, who had been told he didn't have long to live. Gangrene had set in. Hitler wept. The general's wife wrote in her diary that evening, quote, "Afternoon, Hitler here again. Works like medicine." End quote. When Hitler left the hospital, he found a crowd of several hundred had gathered, screaming for their Führer. When they saw him, the emotion was much the same as it had been in 1939 or 1933. The hold he had on the public was still unique to any other figure in the 20th century. One of his SS staff wrote privately a few days later, quote, "Up here you get a far broader view. You see things with a different eye. With our Führer, nothing can possibly go wrong for Germany, or any of us. He is simply wonderful." End quote. On the 26th, General Nikolaus von Vormann wrote after seeing Hitler, quote, "It was a tired, broken man who greeted me, then shuffled over to a chair, his shoulders drooping, and asked me to sit down. Without waiting to find out my business, he began to speak of our coming final victory and the new secret weapons. When I tried to tell him of the impossible situation on the Vistula and in Warsaw, whence I came, he interrupted me. 'Your successor, Ludwig, will get help.' He spoke so softly and hesitantly that it was hard to understand him. His hands trembled so much that he had to grip them between his knees." End quote. On that same day, Himmler met Hitler with some very important news. Irving explains, quote, "Heinrich Himmler arrived with a bulging briefcase of things to discuss. Heading his agenda was the topic, treason since 1939. In a locked safe at Abwehr headquarters outside Berlin, Gestapo investigators had found documents proving that Mayor Girdler, General Oster, General Beck, and above all, Vice Admiral Canaris, the slippery former chief of intelligence, had been plotting Hitler's overthrow since 1939 at least. Canaris and his men had deliberately betrayed the plans and dates of Hitler's 1940 Western campaign to the enemy. These documents had been assembled by two of the Admiral's staff, General Oster and Hans von Donanyi, with a view towards someday prosecuting Brauchitsch, then the army's commander-in-chief, for refusing to aid the anti-Hitler plotters. From General Munoz Grandes, who had commanded Spain's contingent in Russia, Hitler had already learned some time ago that Canaris had personally warned Franco against bringing Spain into the war on Hitler's side. Since his arrest in July, Canaris had told ingenious tales, but those who had rejected the Third Reich, Oster and Donanyi, betrayed their friend Canaris equally willingly in a face-to-face encounter with General Alexander von Kufstein. Former commander of the Brandenburg Division had been arrested on September the 4th, and he had strongly implicated Canaris in the murder plot as well. The Admiral had once discussed using the division to storm the Wolf's Lair. Canaris had confidently predicted Germany's defeat for December 1943. Colonel George Hansen advised his questioners to search for Canaris' diaries. These damning documents were eventually found in the locked safe of another Abwehr colonel who had succumbed to the suicide epidemic after July the 20th. They vanished at the end of the war." End quote. Hitler was so taken aback by the facts about Canaris that he told Jodl he wanted to wait to act until the end of the war. The Vice Admiral was already in custody. At the end of the war, there would be a state trial and the German people could take their revenge, he said. Events were taking their toll on the Führer mentally as well as physically. Hitler's physician recalled a conversation with him, quote, "Says that the weeks since July the 20th have been the worst of his life. He has fought a heroic battle the likes of which nobody, no German, could ever imagine. He has stayed on his feet despite the worst pains and hours of dizziness and nausea, and he has conquered them all with iron determination. Frequently, he says, he was in danger of collapsing, but by sheer willpower he always kept himself under control." End quote. On the 26th of September, Hitler signed off on the Volksstrom order. Originally, it was Guderian's idea, but the party was to be the one who took charge of this new operation. The civilian population would be mobilized, much as Stalin had done the factory workers of Moscow and Leningrad in 1941. The following day, Hitler was attacked by stomach cramps so badly that he had to fight back the urge to scream. The next day, he refused to get out of bed and called his doctor. The Führer looked incredibly yellow. Another doctor felt that he had recognized a case of jaundice, but Morale furiously denied it and insisted on his own strange treatment for the client. In this instance, it was castor oil in his mouth and a warm chamomile tea enema in the other end. Hitler refused to allow his doctor access to his privates and insisted on attempting the enema himself. Between the 28th and the 30th of September, Hitler lost 6 pounds and he was declining fast. The Wolf's Lair was paralysed and the war conferences were endlessly delayed. Whenever any news was read to Hitler, he simply laid there, reactionless. On the 1st of October, General Schmunz died of his injuries from the July the 20th explosion. Hitler's SS adjutant, who had saw him that day, described him as visibly downcast. 3 days later, Schmunz's widow came to see Hitler. The Führer began to cry and said, quote, "It is you who must console me, for mine was the greater loss." End quote. Dr. Giesing pondered what on earth was causing this strange illness. To get to the bottom of it, he tested some of the Dr. Kirster's black Antiga pills himself. He suffered the exact same symptoms as the Führer. Testiness, aversion to light, thirst, loss of appetite, enhanced sense of taste, and even the same stomach cramps as Hitler. The doctor immediately knew he was onto something, and looked at the label of the box more carefully. According to his calculations, Hitler had been literally poisoning himself since Stalingrad due to the pills that Dr. Morale had been giving him. They contained strychnine and atropine. The doctor read out the relevant entries in the poisons manual to the Führer personally. Quote, "Atropine acts on the central nervous system first as a stimulant, then as a paralyzer. In humans, it primarily affects the forebrain, manifesting itself in a state of psychic exaltation. A state of cheerfulness develops, coupled with vivid flights of imagination, talkativeness and restlessness, visual and oral hallucinations, and fits of delirium, which may be peaceful and serene, but may equally degenerate into acts of violence and frenzy." End quote. All of Hitler's doctors immediately united against Morale and accused him of criminal negligence. Hitler, however, stubbornly stuck by his doctor, whom everyone else had long took for a total quack. Hitler said, quote, "Every other German has the right to choose his own doctor. I have chosen Morale." End quote. Morale recorded on the 5th of October, quote, "When I visited the Führer last night, I asked him if I might ask for this one tiny favour, to give me a brief note confirming that I never issued any instructions that he should take quantities of Integer's pills every day, and furthermore that I have repeatedly called for a gastrointestinal x-ray and an examination of the contents of his stomach, but that he never gave permission. The Führer agreed to this and said he would do this in the form of a letter to me." End quote. Hitler completely took Morale's side, and incredibly he dismissed all of his other doctors on the spot. Even Dr. Giesing, the ENT specialist who had discovered the poison, was given the axe. This was a common issue for the Führer. He was too loyal. Incompetents like Goering were kept around, and now criminally negligent doctors like Morale were too. It was a dangerous habit for both his life, and for the war effort at large in Goering's case. Around this time, a notable report reached Hitler reporting on the last days in Estonia before the collapse. Irving writes, quote, "Schörner had allowed 10 days for the evacuation starting on September the 18th. In 70 ships, the German Navy had snatched the last Germans from the Baltic ports and evacuated 100,000 Estonian refugees as well. The local population could hardly believe that the Germans were letting the Russians return, and many announced that they would vanish into the forests and wait for the Germans to come back, as come they surely must. The last Germans to sail out could see a huge Estonian flag unfurled from the tower of the ancient Teutonic castle, Lanki Hermann, and the German war ensign flew alongside, a sign that there were still Estonians minded to put up a fight against the Bolsheviks." End quote. On the 7th of October, the Russians launched their attack in the east. East Prussia, being threatened, brought Hitler out of his bedroom retreat. His staff and generals begged him to leave, but he said, quote, "The East Prussians would say I was leaving them to the Russians, and they'd be right. The wretched people here have already had one taste of the Russian reign of terror in 1914 and 1915. I want to spare them a second dose." End quote. By mid-October, another crisis arose that couldn't be hidden any longer, the Rommel crisis. He had now recovered from his injuries related to a car crash caused by an Allied fighter attack. Reports had reached Bormann from local Nazi officials, stating that they had heard Rommel uttering mutinous remarks. As it turned out, a Colonel von Hofacker had told Rommel of a plot against the Führer when he heard about it. Hofacker didn't realise that this superior would keep this plot to himself. On the 7th of October, Keitel called Rommel and invited him to a meeting, but Rommel declined, stating that his head injury was giving him trouble. On the 12th, a letter was sent from Keitel, dictated by the Führer. It stated that if he considered himself innocent, he should come and see Hitler, but if he did not, then he ought to take the appropriate steps as an officer and gentleman, aka kill yourself. If he did not, he would be dragged before the People's Court. The letter arrived on the 14th. Rommel took the hint and killed himself. That night, Hitler was informed that Rommel had died of his injuries, to which Hitler expressionlessly commented, quote, "There goes another of the old guard." End quote. Hitler granted him a state funeral, since the truth of Rommel's end was to be hidden, but refused to sign his obituary. Quote, "I will not sign this obituary. I will not lie." End quote. On the 15th of October, German agents deposed Admiral Horthy. In late July, Horthy and Hitler had clearly come to some form of arrangement via letters. Horthy had promised to appoint a military government, and in return, the deportations of Hungary's Jewish population were to cease. Over the following months, though, things began to collapse, and endless red flags began to hit Hitler in the face regarding his most unreliable ally. On the 7th of September, Horthy had given an ultimatum to Hitler, demanding 5 fresh panzer divisions within 24 hours, otherwise he would ask the Soviets for an armistice. Hitler agreed to the deal and got Guderian to appease Horthy as much as was possible within the given time, yet the next morning, the German air attaché phoned up with an urgent warning about, quote, "goings-on similar to Romania," end quote. There was to be no repeat of Romania this time, however, and Hitler had plenty of pre-warning. A counter-coup was immediately arranged. After the Romanian coup, the Hungarian and German general staffs had attempted an offensive to capture the Romanian half of Transylvania, where they would then set up a defensive line alongside the mountain range. The offensive fell apart, however, as the Hungarians just suddenly halted without consulting Hitler, clearly for political reasons. More and more requests then came in for Germany's best troops to rush to eastern Hungary. Hitler had heard this story all before in Italy though, and he viewed Horthy much the same way as he did Badoglio. He felt his best divisions were being lured east, so an armistice could be signed, and the best of the German army would then be sacrificed to the Soviets, trapped behind enemy lines. The man called up for the task was the same man who had to rescue Mussolini, Otto Skorzeny. Hitler spent the following weeks deep in thought, scanning the plans for the Hungarian citadel and its complex tunnel system. On the 23rd of September, it was discovered that Horthy had openly put out feelers to the Allies in Italy and Switzerland. The Luftwaffe was put on high alert so that Horthy's family couldn't escape like Mussolini's daughter had. As planning continued, it was discovered that General Baquet, Hungarian commandant of Budapest, was planning to round up German sympathizers. Ferenc Szalasi, the extremely devout Catholic right-wing leader in Hungary, declared his willingness to take over the government. Millions of leaflets were sent to Budapest in sealed police trucks, ready for the coup. The date, however, was constantly postponed, as this was when Hitler was ill. On the 6th of October, the order was sent out to kidnap 4 of the top Horthy men, including General Baquet and Horthy's own son. On the 13th, Horthy ordered his men to retreat, leaving the Germans in the lurch. One of the Germans present wrote in bewilderment, quote, "A major crisis occurred when on October the 13th, a section of the Hungarians, in fact, the very ones who had been most effusive in their friendship towards us gullible soldiers, changed to the enemy side mid-battle," end quote. On the 14th, Hitler got word that Horthy had summoned Wiesenmayer for an audience at noon, which most likely meant that the moment for the coup had arrived. During the night, the Hungarians openly threatened Guderian unless he withdrew all Hungarian troops from the front. Guderian responded by sending his deputy to Budapest with an ultimatum. It was a demand to stop meddling with the Hungarian divisions, and to rescind the orders to withdraw the Hungarian armies within 12 hours. At 10 AM on the 15th, Horthy's son was kidnapped by Skorzeny and his team. The bait was that Marshal Tito, the Yugoslavian communist partisan leader, had an emissary waiting to meet him. Miklos Jr. was duly rolled up into a carpet and sent on board a plane to Vienna. At 12, the Germans met with Horthy. Winkelmann wrote in his report to Himmler, quote, "Wiesenmayer showed up to Horthy's punctually at 12 noon. Horthy immediately launched into a violent tirade, complaining that we had kidnapped his son. Wiesenmayer stood up to him like a man, and didn't have to wheel out the biggest gun we had agreed on, namely to tell the old chap that if there was the least whiff of treachery we would stand his son up against a wall. Horthy threatened to quit the war, but did not commit himself positively as to when. Shortly afterward, his radio broadcast a foul proclamation. Meanwhile, Ambassador Rahn had driven over to Horthy to appeal to his conscience. Horthy was crying like a little boy, kept clutching Rahn's hand, and promising to call everything off, running to the telephone and then not speaking into it, and in general, acting like somebody demented," end quote. The kidnapping of Horthy's son, morality aside, had certainly worked. At 2 PM, the Horthy armistice announcement had been broadcast. The radio building was immediately seized by German police. A new proclamation went out, signed by General Vorosh, supposedly stating that the armistice announcement was null and void. Szalasi then proclaimed power. Horthy and his very small band of supporters retreated into the citadel and pleaded for German support. Horthy was offered to resign and transfer power to Szalasi. If he did so, his son would then be returned to him. If he did not though, then at 6 AM the citadel would be stormed. At 4 AM the next day, Hitler got a call from Budapest stating that Horthy would abdicate the next day, but he had demands. He wanted asylum for himself and his family in Germany, and a promise that the Germans would not blacken his reputation. Hitler agreed and went to bed. The Hungarian generals themselves acted treacherously, despite their leader's rapid change of heart. General Miklos of the 1st Hungarian Army deserted to the Russians, and General von Veresch of the 2nd Army ordered his army to retreat and was then arrested by the Germans. The Red Army tried to take their chance, but the Germans pulled off a heroic defence, allowing a brief respite on the Hungarian front. Meanwhile in the north, Army Group North had been cut off once again, this time in Korezeme in Latvia. Side by side, the Germans and Latvians would remain here until the very end of the war, winning battle after battle, undefeated. On the 16th of October, the Soviets instead came pouring into East Prussia, with the goal being the city of Königsberg itself. A few days later, Keitel was pleading with Hitler for him to return to Berlin. Things weren't looking good. Hitler, however, was barely in reality. He was spending half his days wallowing in bed from his painful illness. A mood of defeatism swept over the Wolf's Lair. One of the Führer's secretaries later wrote, quote, "It made us despair to see the one man who could end all the misery with a stroke of his pen, lying apathetically in bed, gazing at us with weary eyes, while all around us, hell was loose." It was as though the flesh had suddenly realised the futility of the efforts of his will, and had just gone on strike, and Hitler, who had never run into such disobedience before, was caught unawares by it, end quote. Soon enough, though, a miracle occurred. The Soviets were beaten back. The positive feelings, however, were short-lived. The damage they had done to the German civilians in their short time in East Prussia was almost beyond description. General Kriep wrote in his diary, quote, "Visited Hermann Goering Panzer Corps, in combat at Gumbin. In and around Nemmersdorf, women and children crucified on barn doors and shot. I order photographs taken as evidence," end quote. The Führer's secretary wrote, quote, "Gone was his good temper. When we arrived at night for tea, he looked grim and careworn, and he had to make an effort to put these pictures and reports from the Eastern Front out of his mind. Women raped, children massacred. He swore revenge. They aren't human, he said. They're the beasts of the Asiatic steppe. The war I am waging against them is a fight for the dignity of European man. No price is too high for victory." End quote. Hitler refused to leave the wolf's lair. Everyone bar him seemed jumpy at the thought of Nemensdorf repeating itself to them. His secretaries asked if they should learn to use pistols, to which the Führer responded, quote, "No thank you, ladies. I have no desire to die at the hands of one of my secretaries." End quote. On the home front, things were as bad as ever. With France lost, there was no longer any early warning systems. The Allied bombing campaign was now so grim that it's hard to keep track of. Day after day, night after night, cities were bombed to the ground, big and small, all across Germany. Medical supplies were essentially unobtainable, and disease was becoming rampant. Those that were lucky enough not to be blown to pieces or burnt to death had minimal odds of surviving in the ruins of their cities. Rats roamed the streets, burrowing through dead bodies. It was without exaggeration, hell on earth. There was simply no way to defend the people anymore, not that the Luftwaffe had been very competent at it before. Hitler plotted his revenge in private, but indeed the odds of that ever happening were now slim to none, and his enemies knew it. They stepped up their brutality accordingly, knowing that the Germans had almost no chance of inflicting any form of revenge upon them. In terms of the air war, there was one small positive. The Me-262 jet, designed as a bomber, not a fighter now, was finally in service. Just as Hitler predicted, it was causing absolute chaos on the large enemy troop assemblies in the Low Countries. The V-2 rockets continued to rain down on London too. He gloated to his secretaries, quote, "No population can hold out under such an uninterrupted bombardment. Their nerves won't stand it, because there is no warning from the sirens. Sheer panic will grip the masses and drive them out into the open countryside." But just imagine what that means. For millions of people to swarm out to where there is neither roof nor rafter to accommodate them. It will be an avalanche of misery and suffering, because even when the people get there, the local villagers will regard them as a plague. What parliamentary government can survive that? End quote. Hitler at this time began to rely on the old reliable cope, that the Soviets and the Allies were about to fall out. There were signs at the time which did make him seem correct. Stalin had given the British and American delegations 24 hours in which to leave Bulgaria, and his invasions in general of Romania and Bulgaria were a total violation of the Tehran Agreement of 1943, which Cicero, the German agent in Turkey, had shown. Also, Stalin's annexation of eastern Poland was causing absolute uproar in London and Washington, as the people realised that the entire cause of the war had been a total lie. They were fighting to hand over Eastern Europe to Stalin. The alliance between the two sides may have been teetering, but they certainly weren't stupid enough to fall out during the war. Ribbentrop and Sonnleitner especially urged Hitler to take up the vague peace feelers Stalin was supposedly putting out. After much persuasion, he agreed, but added ominously, quote, "If this does not lead to peace with the Soviets, we shall have to fight them all over again on some more propitious occasion. Communism is never going to abandon its aim of Bolshevik world domination. Nobody else will be able to fight this battle. I myself shall have to win it for the German people." End quote. Meanwhile in Britain, Anthony Eden openly admitted that relations with Stalin were strained. The Allies had also allowed the Germans to retreat freely in the Balkans so that they could head to the battlefields in Hungary, which annoyed Stalin to no end. In Iran, British and American oil interests were squabbling with the Russian oil interests, and in Greece, the British-appointed government had just disbanded the communist guerrillas in the country. Russian tanks were swarming all over the Bulgarian border with Turkey too, 100 miles away from the much-coveted prize of every Russian government for almost half a millennium, the Dardanelles. Hitler felt something had to give. He speculated to those around him, quote, "Perhaps they have disengaged a tactical wing to be on the safe side, because for all the polite phrases they are swapping, the tension seems to be building up. Perhaps they are disengaging it to transfer it to Greece or to here. It's quite definite that the Russians will attack there. And when you're on one shore of the Dardanelles, you don't just stop there. You can only use the waterway if you control both shores, so you'll have to take the second bit as well. And that will start the whole structure toppling. My view is that the British are standing by because vital interests are at stake." End quote. Early in the morning on the 8th of November, Hitler suddenly sent for his physician, who noted the next day, quote, "All of a sudden the Führer was attacked by spasms in the sternum and massive gas build-up in the abdomen. As he told me, he was momentarily about to make the biggest decision of his life, hence the increasingly violent nervous strains." End quote. The decision was big indeed, for next month the Allies were about to be hit with the Führer's counterattack, which he had by now been preparing for months. The Allies had tried attacks at Arnhem, Aachen, and now Antwerp, all of which had been incredibly costly for the Anglo-Americans. Hitler ordered Aachen defended house by house, much like Stalingrad had been, and he said that like he ordered in Paris, the enemy was to find nothing but a field of ruins if they did get in. The Allies had finally taken the town on the 21st of October, but found that the time spent had been used by the Germans to build up the west wall to the east. In fact, Hitler said he wanted them to keep pushing around Aachen, for it would bring more and more troops into the trap for when his counteroffensive started up. In early November, Patton tried his luck. He proudly boasted that he would reach the Saar in 3 days, and then, quote, easily breached the West Wall, end quote. Yet 8 days later, he had advanced only 15 miles through the mud and minefields before being beaten back by the Germans. Things in the West seemed hopeful, or at least hopeful given the circumstances. Hitler was unrelenting in his plans. He allowed risk literally anywhere else if it meant his divisions could stay put, ready for his grand offensive. On the 20th of November, Hitler secretly left East Prussia for the West. One of his secretaries wrote, quote, I had come to love the forest life and East Prussia's landscape. Now we were leaving them forever. Hitler probably knew that too, although he had ordered the construction work continued, as though he intended to return one day. He too was in a farewell mood. Had he not always maintained that so long as he personally commanded any sector, it had never been abandoned? His carriage windows were blacked out. He sat in his compartment with the light switched on, at twilight like a museum. I had never seen Hitler as dejected and distant as on this day. His voice barely rose above a whisper. His eyes were rooted to a spot on a white tablecloth. An oppressive atmosphere crowded in on the narrow, swaying cage around us. Hitler suddenly began to talk about an operation and about his confidence in Professor von Eichen's skill. It's a great responsibility for him, but he's the only one who can do it. An operation on the vocal cords isn't dangerous, but it may leave me with no voice, end quote. Hitler had been complaining about losing his voice for months. As is known, his voice was one of the very sources of his power, and the thought of losing it terrified him. He was willing to risk the operation. At 5:30 a.m. on the 21st, Hitler arrived in Berlin, where he would remain for the next 3 weeks. The operation on his throat was a success. It was just a small polyp, referred to as a singer's knot. His voice slowly returned. By early December, he was only able to whisper. On the 1st of December, Goebbels came to him to speak about the upcoming offensive. He wrote, quote, when I consider how sickly and weak he was when I saw him bedridden several weeks ago, when he already outlined these same great plans to me, then I can only say that a miracle has come over him, end quote. Hitler said to him that if they succeeded with the upcoming offensive, then the Anglo-Americans would be Dunkirked once again, and he could then restart the V1 bombing of southern England. Presumably, this was his hope to end the war, cut off the Allies in France, and bomb England to pieces until they threw in the towel. Indeed, the British public was growing increasingly weary of a personally costly war. They weren't even sure why they were fighting anymore. On the 3rd of December, Hitler visited the Goebbels family at their lakeside home for the last time. He proudly boasted that very soon the tide would turn. The British media was being far too hasty in their declarations of an imminent victory, he said. On the 10th of December, he set off for the Western Front, more specifically his Eagle's Nest headquarters, built in 1940 at Bad Nauheim. Soon enough, he was meeting with his generals and getting them up to speed on what he had planned. Morel wrote, quote, Führer had a conference lasting several hours with around 40 or 50 generals. They say he was very alert and lively, inspiring and compelling, end quote. Hitler spoke of those calling to surrender. In reference to Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War, he said, quote, whatever they do, they cannot expect me to surrender. Never, never. His state presidents, his ministers, turned up from Berlin in droves to beg him to stop the war because it could no longer be won. But the tenacity of that one man made it possible to fight on until finally the tide miraculously turned. To suggest that if the throne hadn't changed hands in Russia, the tide would not have changed is quite beside the point, because if they had stopped the war in the 5th year, a throne change in the 7th would have been neither here nor there. That is the moment we have to wait for, end quote. On the topic of the enemy's shaky alliance, he continued, he said that never in history had such a coalition managed to stick together. Quote, if you sit at the center of a web, like a spider, and following this trend, you can see how from hour to hour the contrast between them grow. If we throw in a few really powerful punches, we may at any moment see this entire artificially erected common front suddenly collapse with a mighty clap of thunder, end quote. On the 16th of December at 5:30 a.m., the Great Offensive began in the Ardennes. It was all or nothing. Quote, Frederick II earned the title The Great, not because he was victorious, but because he did not despair in adversity. Equally, posterity will come to recognize me, because I too shall never have surrendered after grievous misfortunes, end quote. On the 25th of November, he had said to his commanders, quote, this war would determine the survival or extinction of the German people. It demands the unqualified commitment of every individual. Even seemingly hopeless situations have been mastered by the blind courage and bravery of the troops, the stubborn steadfastness of all ranks, and by calm, unyielding leadership, end quote. The German people were of much the same mind. In the West, Churchill had openly stated that Eastern Germany would be ethnically cleansed. The land would be cleared of Germans and given to Poland. In the East, Stalin had given troops the order to, quote, do as they please when it came to looting and robbing. Worst of all, the Morgenthau Plan was now open knowledge. The deaths of perhaps 40 million Germans after the war, if the plan was implemented in its entirety, was enough to keep even the most exhausted Wehrmacht or SS soldier fighting till the last. Hitler's predictions for the counterattack, at least initially, were perfect. Everyone else had said otherwise, but Hitler said that Stalin was waiting for the Allies and the Germans to exhaust themselves before he launched his great offensive in the east. Hitler was right. The enemy, too, had been completely caught unawares as the Germans poured forwards. The traitors of the past were now either dead or awaiting trial. Except for the Allied codebreakers, the Germans were now for the first time in the war playing on a somewhat even playing field when it came to planning and secrecy. Hitler had ordered total radio silence regarding the operation, and any potentially suspect troops, such as those from Alsace, were removed from the front line. The battle was to be completely uneven at first, 28 German divisions against 5 American. Morale, quite rightly, was sky high. When Hitler woke up at 11:30 on the 16th of December, the infantry was already deep into enemy territory. Morale said at midday, quote, "He is very alert and lively, but got no sleep because of the coming offensive," end quote. Karl Fott wrote of the war conference that day, quote, "When Reinitz and I went over at 3 p.m. for the war conference, the Führer was already there, contrary to his custom. It was only too evident how delighted he was at the first magnificent news of our offensive. Even before the conference, the Reich press chief, Dr. Dietrich, told us, 'Well, at last you're going to get something cheerful to take down.' To Hitler, the battle was already as good as won. That day he ordered the German Navy to do everything possible to prevent British ships escaping from Antwerp before and after Sepp Dietrich's SS 6th Panzer Army got there," end quote. Within the first 5 days, 25,000 American prisoners had been taken, and 350 enemy tanks had been destroyed. The Allied Air Force was still nowhere to be seen due to the weather. On the 19th, Hitler had already proclaimed victory, as was customary for him. In his eyes, the US First Army confronting them was already beaten. By the 22nd, Eisenhower was forced to call off all attacks on the Western Front, as quite how serious this attack was began to sink in. 16 to 20 Allied divisions were now on their way. Hitler remained confident, however. Whilst this was going on, pro-Soviet elements in Greece attacked British troops. Churchill had flown out, according to Hitler, quote, "with his tail between his legs," and he wants people to believe him capable of stopping the tide of Bolshevism in Europe, end quote. On the 20th of December, the so-called Great Soviet Offensive in the East came and went. This was supposed to be the big day. Hitler gleefully said, quote, "You see, perhaps we've made it after all," end quote. The smile was quickly wiped from his face. On the 23rd, the skies cleared, and the Allied Air Force appeared and took total control. Bombers wreaked havoc behind German lines. Railroads came to a standstill, and the over-motorized German divisions were bombed to pieces in their traffic jams. Hitler personally watched as 2,000 enemy bombers flew over his head. At lunch that day, his secretary, Christa Schroeder, said, quote, "Mein Führer, we have lost the war, haven't we?" end quote. Hitler angrily replied that they had not. He also said around the same time, when asked why the war needed to continue, quote, "The war cannot last as long again as it has already lasted. Nobody could stand it, neither we nor the others. The question is, which side will crack first? And I say that the side that lasts longer will do so only if it stands to lose everything. We stand to lose everything. If America says, 'Cut, stop, no more American boys for Europe,' it won't hurt them. But if we say today, 'We've had enough, we're packing up,' then Germany will cease to exist," end quote. Ribbentrop, meanwhile, did not agree. There were more rumours of peace feelers from Stalin, and once again Ribbentrop offered himself up. This had been his great dream for years now, a Soviet-German rapprochement. He offered to fly with his family to Moscow, to which Hitler replied, quote, "Ribbentrop, don't pull a Rudolf Hess on me," end quote. Hitler, however, took Stalin's lack of offensive as a weakness. The Red Army must be exhausted, he reasoned. Why would he make peace on such terms? On the 20th, though, the Soviets did attack, not in Germany, but in Hungary. Salaschi had declared that Budapest would be defended to the last. A house-by-house defence was sanctioned. By the 24th, though, Budapest was surrounded. On the 26th, Guderian begged for reinforcements and he was given them. They were taken from the west. A counterattack was planned for New Year's Day to relieve the Hungarian capital, which was so vital. Without Hungarian aluminium or fuel, there were no planes. Guderian remarked on New Year's Eve to his Hungarian counterpart, quote, "By deliberately taking a very grave risk on the rest of the Eastern Front, we have done everything possible to restore firm contact with Budapest," end quote. Hitler wasn't coping well with developments. It was all falling apart again. On the 30th, Morel wrote, quote, "For 2 days he's had a queasy stomach with gaseous build-up. He says from a green pea soup he had, but in my view it comes from nervousness over what lies ahead, composing a speech and delivering it, and secondly, evidently, some major military event," end quote. Despite the ominous signs, Hitler pushed on and tried to react to events. A new plan was set up named North Wind to take the Americans from behind. Hitler stated, quote, "The Purpose of all these attacks will mainly be to eliminate the Americans south of our entry point, to destroy them bit by bit, to eliminate them division by division." End quote. This attack truly was the last roll of the dice. Rundstedt recognised as much. He knew they had to succeed. Quote, "If not, it will mean the end of our offensive operations and a transition to a defensive war of attrition. But no matter what, the important result remains that for the time being we have rid the Rhine and Palatinate of the threat of an enemy invasion." End quote. On the 31st, North Wind began. In 1945, it was all clearly going to come to a head. By the end of the year, the Führer himself looked worse than ever too. Admiral Heinz Assmann wrote, quote, "His hand clasp was weak and soft. All his movements were those of a senile man. Only his eyes retained their flickering gleam and penetrating look." End quote. And with that, the year came to a close. Thank you very much for watching. If you made it this far, then please do leave a like on the video. It helps immensely. The next and final episode shouldn't be nearly as long for obvious reasons, so hopefully it'll be out soon after this one. As always though, the biggest thank you of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribestar and YouTube members who make these videos possible. Without their kind support, I simply would not be able to do this for a living, and I cannot thank them enough. So if you'd like to support the channel, join our Discord or our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, then please do consider signing up in one of the links in the description. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Guys Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksaka Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Mr. Gaming, Cameron, Sludwig 1919, Gloomy, Troy Harser, Jagdkampf, Rowan, Swedish Chef, Honda, Mirko, David Byers, Max Anton, Gragas, Conqueror, Espen, Khan, Luka Marincic, Veritas Unleashed, DeReal G, Joel, Ghost 0128, Jack, Bobby Atkinson, John DeGrief, Ward, Crankless, Dramatic Equation, Russ Hale, Senator Armstrong, Lucas Drury, Mark Smith, Shameful Display, Sneed Seedenfeed, Bruno, Emma Magishmael, William S, Ozymandias, Sword Dog, Aussie Ones, Prada, Aussie Zuma, Joe Ford, Jive Ginseng, Mr. Toad, Leigh Agnew, Carolyn J, Alex D, Violently Normal, Brendan Stout, K Reich, Unlikely Balmer, Enclave, Welcome to Kali Yuga, The Alt Vault, Justin F, Lane Perkins, King Fried Chicken, Rene Malmgren, Gianni Rabati, Panzer Jim, Aopa Ahola, Laudel, Hans, Chris, Jordan Troy, Jihad Gandalf, Aifel, Lucas Leixenring, The Hog Shotgun, Bjorn Richter, Grady Peters, Patrick Finn, Nemesis 88, Mike and Johnny Secret Pod, Emil Flinch, Panzer Wagenlied, Rand Atlas 1902, Dustin Stratton, Tyler Yoshida, What Next, Heinz Haber, Pax Tibi Marseille, Zuma Historian is the Best, Pat Mike, Genesis Vice, Ace Gunner, Martin Harkinson, John Sonkerly, Scar, Chronic Military Collector, Jan Kalivoda, Herwig Holger, Toons Tierney, Gerald Lorenz, Devin Lay, Henry Ramdas Jr., Adam Croucher, Melvin Cade, Pooper, Ooga Booga, Colin Maloney, Zan, North, Ibby, Avery Moller, Varangian Guard, Kirk Weaver, Hendrik Mueller, John Shelton, Surfer Dude, Dakota Rosson, Micah Holly, Edelman, Random Person 24, D, Gertz, No Name 325, Sinful Hero, Agent, Pragmatic Culture, W. Justin Walls, Mortales, Sebastian, Andy, Matthew Bragdon, Jalil, Alex F, Quinton Lewis, Sam W, Scotty Hode, Hail Mary, Luther Bryanson, It's Okay to be a Nationalist, Inflection Point, Vet Exempt, Automat 762X39, Monsoir Mercier, Charlie Black, Will from Florida, History by Grayscale, Friendly Fash, Jonathan S. Marinsky, Demetrius Laquan Fauci, Christian, Arminius' Revenge, Mini Monies, Gerd von Rundstedt's 14-inch turds, The Waller, Suma Klubiek, Jorgen 1997, Admiral Kempinski, Carl Jung, James Ferris, Ana Paula Gomez Coelho, Pavementer 86, Kurt Linde, The Glorious Lion, Omega, Kirk Panzer, Final, Son of Tiamat, Luke, Shifty Sheriff 2, Gerard, and Aberration.